Hello, everybody. This is In Philosopher's Garb. I'm a Christian theologian, and I recently had a discussion/debate with another Christian theologian, Joshua Sijuwade, on the topic of the Trinity. Now, we are both Trinitarians. Josh is a monarchical Trinitarian, and I am a partialist, or hold to something like Trinity monotheism. And we had a heated discussion about our differences, and in this video, I want to analyze and kind of walk through some of what happened in that debate, kind of do like a debate review/analysis. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I don't think anybody walked away from this debate like happy with how it went down. Me, Than, Josh, the audience, we all walked away, I think, probably in a bad mood. And I've gone back and forth about whether to make this video that I'm currently doing because part of me thinks that making a video discussing this debate is just gonna like fuel fires that maybe should be left to die or kind of like put salt on wounds or just like not let things heal. But the other part of me feels like I need to just like address some of what went down in this debate if for no other reason than like my own personal catharsis and like sanity. So if I played every section of this debate and I commented on all of it, this video would just be like 92 hours long and nobody wants that. And this video is already probably going to be too long. So what I'm going to do is I plan to summarize some areas, and then I'm going to focus in on areas that I think ended up being rather significant, and I'm going to like show more clips of that and spend more time walking through that. And I'm going to focus on kind of two major things in this video. The first thing I'll be kind of talking about is the arguments that were put forth and the actual, kind of substance of the debate and, things like that. And did my critiques land? Did Josh's critiques land? So on and so forth. And the second thing I want to address is kind of a more meta level discussion about like the debate itself. Specifically, how did Josh engage rhetorically in this debate? How did I engage rhetorically in this debate? How did he maneuver? How did I maneuver? So on and so forth. And it's here worth noting that there has been some drama about this debate because I have already publicly essentially accused Josh out, called Josh out on him deviating from what it was the agreed upon format for the discussion, right? Like, I think he deviated from the agreed upon format of this discussion, and I think he derailed things. I'll show some clips in this, and I'll show the evidence for that, and I'll let you all make up your minds. It maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. That's fine. I'll just kind of want to put out the evidence for that in this video, and people can come to their own conclusions about that drama. I will touch on the things related to that, and so there's likely going to be probably some other issues that come up as we discuss this meta-level discussion about the debate itself. So, okay, with that said, I'm stop yapping about that. Let's go ahead and hop into it. So I'm going to begin with a very brief synopsis of events that led up to this debate. All right. So Josh did a live stream with Mike and Than over at Inspiring Philosophy, in which Josh put forth his view of the Trinity. I made a video critiquing that video. I posted my critique of Josh's view and the live stream he did with Inspiring Philosophy and Than. I posted that on a Facebook group that we were both in, and Josh offered to have a public discussion with me about my objections after he saw that video. And so for those of you who don't know, Josh is a monarchical Trinitarian. Now, I think he's recently started using a different label, but that's the label he's been applying to himself in the past. I don't remember the specific label he's using now, so I'm going to call it a monarchical Trinitarian. He holds that the Father and the Father alone can be identified with Yahweh, the one true God. Josh believes that the Father causes or grounds the existence of the Son, who is an external divine person. By external, I mean that under Josh's view, Jesus is not identical to Yahweh, and Jesus is not a part of Yahweh. So Jesus is not like internal to the being of Yahweh. Jesus is an external person whose existence is caused or grounded by Yahweh, and the Son shares the divine nature same divine nature as Yahweh, despite the Son being dependent on Yahweh for his existence. So under Josh's view, God is not three in one. Under Josh's view, there are three persons, only one of which is actually God, and the others can just be called God metonymically because of the functions that they play, like being God's representative or stuff like that. That's kind of a general, summary of Josh's view. Now, in contrast, I think that Jesus, the Son, is internal to Yahweh. That is to say, I think that there is one true God, Yahweh, and that the Father is part of Yahweh. I think there are two plausible ways that you could hold to the idea that the Son is part of Yahweh. One thing that you could say is you could say that Yahweh is the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Spirit, those taken together as a whole. That's what Yahweh is. God is three in one in a very literal sense here. Jesus is part of the Trinity, so Jesus is part of Yahweh. It's pretty straightforward. The second option you could hold to is that the Father is Yahweh and that the Son is a part of the Father. Now, I don't currently have a very firm view on which of these two options is better. I am undecided between the two of them. Which one I lean more towards kind of depends on what day you ask me, and I'm not sure that there's enough data for me to strongly say one way or the other which one of these is correct. I think there's a handful of issues, and how you weight those issues are going to kind of decide which one of these two internalist models comes out to be more plausible. So rather than arguing for one, I will just put both of these forward as an option on the table. Both of these, though, are internalists. They're partialists in the sense that the Son is part of Yahweh. Whether or not Yahweh is identified as the Father or as identified as the Trinity, Jesus is going to be, part of Yahweh in either one. Some people have accused me of being like a sophist and like not committing myself to a model, which I feel really bizarre. I think it's really odd if I can recognize that there are two plausible ways to cash this out, and I just don't think the data hasn't convinced me one way or the other yet between these two options. I don't think it's sophistry for me to say, okay, I don't know which one of the two it is here, but I think it's definitely one of these two. So anyways, so that's most of the backdrop for what you need to know going into this debate. But there's one final thing that needs to be discussed and emphasized, which is that Josh explicitly requested to have this discussion with me be formatted in a certain way. He requested that this conversation primarily be about my objections to his view. He wanted to have this discussion be mostly me bringing my objections that I have against his view, and then he would address my objections against his view. He only wanted to briefly address problems that he saw in my model at the end of our discussion, right? And after I have presented all of my objections. Now, I explicitly asked Josh, how much time do you want us to block off for that section where you get to, take swings at me, and, how much time do we need to leave for you to have that time to critique my position? And Josh just said, we'll do it with whatever time we have left at the end, and and we can wing it, right? And I have posted pictures from my Facebook conversation with Josh on a post on my community page, so everybody can see that not only did Josh specifically request the format I just described, I actively tried to schedule time to set aside for him to attack my view, so that he would get a fair shake and all that. I came into this really trying to be structured and make sure that this was organized well, and he declined that offer that I made regarding that. This is going to be very important as we get into the discussion, because roughly 45 minutes or so into our 2.5 hour discussion, Josh apparently changed his mind on this and started taking philosophical swings at my view, which I'm completely fine with Josh taking philosophical swings at my view. Like I said, I tried to block out time for him to get the chance to do that. But, if we're going to say we're going to do a certain structure, like, okay, like, are we just going to change it midway? And so I've called, Josh out on I felt like he was derailing the conversation for a good bit. But anyways, we're getting ahead of ourselves there. So let's start by summarizing how the debate went up to that point and kind of just looking at the arguments put forth. So the debate begins with some brief conversation, and then we hop into things by me and Josh giving both roughly about 5 minutes introduction to our views. This went fine. That went as planned. Not super interesting. I'm not going to talk much about that. Now, at this point, according to the agreed upon format, I would start working through the list of objections that I had for Josh's view, and this is exactly what I did. So the first objection that I raised against Josh is that I think his view required an inconsistency in how he interprets passages in Scripture, that I don't think he can justify that inconsistency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this objection, because it's only, I think it's maybe like 5 minutes or something like that. I'm going to play it in its entirety so that everybody knows exactly what I said and what I didn't say.
Kind of one of Josh's main arguments that I want to press on is that the New Testament identifies the Father as Yahweh. So this is the first area I want to challenge. So when Josh argues for the Father being identified with Yahweh in the New Testament, he cites several scriptures in which the Greek word theos, which is translated to God, is used in connection with the Father. And he usually cites these verses and claims that they identify the Father as Yahweh. However, I want to pause and examine the underlying assumptions of this argument. Suppose I was to ask him, hey Josh, why does referring to the Father as theos entail identification with Yahweh? Suppose I pointed out that theos was used at this time to refer to all sorts of beings who were not Yahweh. It referred to pagan Greek gods, to humans, to Satan, so on and so forth. Why then should we assume that the use of theos necessarily refers to Yahweh and has this identity, right? Presumably, Josh might want to respond by saying, well, James, you silly goose, while theos was used broadly, we have to look at how a first century Jewish author would use that word. And when we do that, we see that theos for first century Jews was primarily a way of referring to Yahweh. For them, Yahweh was the only true theos, right? So when they refer to the Father as theos, or as the only true theos, or as our theos, we can understand that they are connecting the Father with Yahweh. In short, Yahweh language is being attributed to the Father, so we can conclude that the Father is being identified with Yahweh. That's what I think the general thrust of the argument is kind of going on under the hood here, right? And at first glance, I think this sounds pretty reasonable. However, if this is the reasoning that undergirds Josh's arguments and the proof text that he cites, then it also gives us an equally powerful reason for saying that the New Testament identifies Jesus as Yahweh. Theos was not the only word first century Jews could use to refer to Yahweh. Another term was the Greek word kurios, which is translated as Lord. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, places that originally contained the divine name Yahweh were rendered with kurios instead. Kurios became a substitute for the divine name. For a first century Jew, there was only one true kurios just as much as there's only one true theos. So when the New Testament authors refer to Jesus as kurios, I think by the same logic Josh would be using for the Father being called theos, we must then conclude that Jesus is also being identified with Yahweh. For the application of kurios to Jesus is just as much an application of Yahweh language as theos is. Now, I know Josh has a response to this, right? His move is to say, oh, no, 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 no. In these instances, Jesus is not being identified with Yahweh. He's being called Yahweh in a metonymical sense. But here's the issue I see with that. Josh's claim there, I don't think is grounded in anything in the New Testament passages themselves. It is an interpretive decision that Josh makes, not because the text requires it or indicates it, but because his theological system requires it. And then what I think ends up happening is Josh ends up going through scripture, and when Yahweh language is applied to the Father, Josh tells us those are identity statements. Those are clear identifications of the Father as Yahweh. But when the Yahweh language is used in application to the Son, then he dismisses it as merely metonymical. And I think this is entirely arbitrary. It's not based on the text. It's based on the pre-committed theology. So to kind of wrap this up, here's my challenge, I think, to you, Joshua. The way I see it, I think you have three options in front of you. Option one, I think you can give us a scriptural argument for explaining why all the Yahweh language about the Father should be taken as an identity, whereas all the Yahweh language about the Son should be dismissed as metonymical, right? And to do that, you would need to like get into doing some exegesis with the text itself. Or option two, be consistent in your methodology and conclude that the Son is identified with Yahweh just as much as the Father is. Or option three, be consistent in your methodology, but in the opposite direction and conclude that the Yahweh language applied to both the Father and Son, those aren't identity statements in either case. So I think those are your options. And just to be clear here, the issue I'm challenging Josh on here is his claim that the New Testament identifies the Father as Yahweh. I'm at this point, I'm picking one of the pillars that Josh uses to support his position, and I'm questioning the justification for that pillar. My internalist position doesn't stand or fall on this topic on whether or not Yahweh is identical to the Father, so I can go either way. But Josh's position, I think the stakes are high for him on this. So, Josh, let's maybe look at some of your favorite proof texts. Maybe if you want, we could start at like 1 Corinthians 8:6, something like that, and you can maybe show me what you're thinking.
Okay.
So a couple of things to point out here. I make it explicitly clear that this is not an argument for my view. This is an undercutting defeater for Josh's view. All I'm doing is like pointing to his previously used arguments and saying they don't work. I am also making abundantly clear that my view does not hang or fall on this point, but Josh's view I think does. I said all of this because I knew going into this debate that people watching were probably going to have difficulty keeping track of what the actual argument is and what was at stake and so on and so forth. So my objection at this point is essentially, hey man, justify your inconsistency. Now, Josh spends a good bit of time trying to meet this challenge, and here's a brief sketch of how that went down. So Josh begins by pointing out that kurios is applied to the Father, which I agree with as well. And since the challenge that I had just raised to Josh was that he needed to show why Yahweh statements about the Father were identity statements, by bringing up this at this point in the dialogue, it seemed like Josh was insinuating that this was evidence for taking the Yahweh language as identity statements about the Father. Like, so the fact that he thinks that kurios, which means Lord, is also applied to the Father, it seemed to be like he was suggesting that this was some type of reason for taking these statements about the Father to be identity statements. So I asked Josh about whether he was using that as the reason for, this kind of inconsistency, and he said that, well, that's just the starting point out. He just wanted to start out by saying that, pointing out that the Father is called kurios. And I agree with that. I'm not 100% sure why Josh picked this area to begin with, but that's an area we agreed with, so yeah, we'll just skate past that. So me and Josh then agree that kurios is sometimes used in reference to the Father, and that theos is sometimes used in reference to the Son. But then Josh contends that when this language is used to the Father, it can't be metonymical. And then he tries to argue that by going to verses which indicate that the Son plays a mediating role between the Father and mankind. And I agree that the Son is the mediator between the Father and humans. What I don't agree with is that this mediation somehow justifies Josh's inconsistent interpretation of Yahweh language in the New Testament when it comes to being applied to the Son versus being applied to the Father. So let's look at one of the ways that Josh tries to argue this. One of the ways that he does this is by paying attention to the statements that are used in 1 Corinthians 8:6. So let me play a brief clip of that here.
The very famous verse, 1 Corinthians 8:6, which says, yet for us there's one God the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. Now, what is the prepositions in those specific statements? They're saying one is a source and one is a mediatorial being, because it says from whom all, and then
Wait,
through.
can I pause you here real quick though?
Yep.
Because I could grant you that the Father is the source of the Son. I could grant you eternal generation, and we can come back
No,
to
I'm
that
not
later.
talking about that though. I'm not talking about
Okay.
that.
Okay. So
Yeah.
let's say so the
Yeah.
Father. Okay. So then I'll let you continue. I'm
Yeah,
not.
I'm not
Yeah.
talking about that. I'm saying,
Okay.
look, okay, because he's not talking about the relationship between the Father and the Son.
Okay.
He's talking about what is the relationship between God, the one God, and us, and the one Lord and us. Okay. Now, what does it say with the prepositional use? The prepositions that are used in 1 Corinthians 8 is from whom are all things, and for whom we exist. So he's saying all things exist for him, and our goal is him. Because then it says, as it says there, and for whom we exist. So our purpose is for the existence of the Father. But then when it speaks about the Lord, what does it say the prepositional use for him is? It doesn't repeat it and say, well, they're equally Yahweh, equally God, so it's equally from whom and equally for whom. No, it then says, through whom are all things. So he's the means by which we exist, the means that the one God uses for us to exist, and then through whom we exist. And so the key point here, what I'm saying to you is, and other verses you can bring here is, what is the role of the Son? The Son is taken to be a mediator within the New Testament between God and humanity.
Yes.
Now,
Okay, so in that clip you just saw, Josh was harping pretty hard on those statements in 1 Corinthians 8:6, so it sure seemed like his argument was that we can understand the Father as being identified with Yahweh because of these statements in 1 Corinthians 8:6 about everything is for the Father, but all things are merely through the Son. In fact, in that clip you just saw Josh points out that in 1 Corinthians 8:6, it does not equally say for whom and from whom for both. Through whom or from whom is used for Christ, but for whom is used for the Father. And part of Josh's argument is that Christ is not described as the one for whom are all things. Josh says that all things are for the Father, but through Christ. Now, I think that this argument is a significant error on Josh's part because we see in Colossians 1:16 Paul say all things are for Christ. And in Romans 11:33-36, Paul says all things are through the Father. So this distinction that Josh is trying to create of, oh, well, all things are for the Father and merely through the Son, that is a distinction that Paul himself destroys in his other letters. He says that all things are through the Son and all things are for the Son. He says all things are for the Father and all things are through the Father. He says that there's language of both, right? So things are not looking good here for Josh's argument. So because Josh is harping on these specific phrases in 1 Corinthians so much, I actually ask him, is this your argument? Are you putting the weight on these statements here? Because this is what it seems like. And his response confuses me. So consider this clip.
Not in the other. And it seems like, and let me correct me if I'm wrong.
yes.
It seems like you're building the case that in 1 Corinthians 8:6, the one of these is an identity statement merely because of the phrase after this about us being for one and us through one. Is that correct, that you're putting all of the one of these is an identity statement because of that phrase that comes afterwards?
No. If you understand what I've said correctly, what I'm saying to you is, what is the New Testament's witness about who is the representative in the relationship between the Father and the Son? Is it that the Father is a representative of the Trinity, God, the Son, the Spirit? Or is it that the Son is taken to be the representative of another?
Okay, so then it seems like he was just pointing out all of that to justify the idea that the Son is the mediator between the Father and humanity, which I agree with. But I don't know how you get from that, the Son is the mediator between the Father and humanity, to the issue at hand, which is that the Father is identified with Yahweh in all these verses, but apparently the Son isn't, right? But the Son is just Yahweh in a metonymical sense. I don't know how you get from A to B there. And so it's at this point that I'm going to start going more line by line and being more specific on what was said, because I think, frankly, we're about to see Josh be sloppy in his exegetical logic. So let's see how Josh cashes out everything that he's been building so far in this conversation, right?
So what I'm saying to you is, let's say Yahweh language is used for the Father. Can that be anything but identity?
I don't see why it couldn't be metonymical as well.
So
it
he
seems
could be
like
wait, hold on. Let me get what you're saying. So the Father can be a representative of some other entity.
Okay, so I want to pause here because notice how Josh just misrepresented what I just said. All I said was that the Father could have Yahweh language applied to him in a metonymical sense. Now, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a metonym is, quote, a figure of speech consisting of the use of the name of one thing for that of another, of which it is an attribute or with which it is associated, end quote. There is nothing in that definition, in the concept of a metonym, that requires the concept of mediation or representation or something like that, right? Like at all. And so for Josh to jump from my statement that the Father can be called Yahweh in a metonymical sense to therefore I'm saying the Father is representing, another to us, that just doesn't follow. And so I question Josh on his use of the word metonymical, because maybe Josh is using it in a really specific idiosyncratic way to just mean representation. But then he immediately shows that he knows better when I ask him about that. Like he shows that he knows it doesn't just mean that. And so the next clip I'm going to show you is very, very important to how the rest of the conversation and the drama that comes about later, how it all unfolds, right? So Josh has just showcased this weird association between saying something is metonymical and saying that there is some type of mediation or representation going on. And Josh had also just blatantly misrepresented me, right, and what I had said. At this stage in the conversation, the clip you were about to see, I am now presenting a way that that one could say that the Father is Yahweh in a metonymical sense, without needing to bring in concepts of mediation or representation, stuff like that. At this point, Josh has been, I think, sloppy and imprecise with his use of the word metonymical, and I am now trying to clarify that. Notice that I precede my spiel here by saying that this is an example, and the context is, what does metonymical mean? So let's look at this clip.
You use metonymical to mean just representative of?
Well, I mean, it doesn't just have to be, but
okay, okay. So let me give an example. So, for instance, amongst other theologians who hold a position that would say that Yahweh is the Trinity. So, someone like William Lane Craig. Now, to be fair, Craig has been workshopping his position a bit, and so if he happens to watch this, maybe he would disagree with my language. But someone then would say that the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, someone like Craig would say, or at least has said something along the lines of, we can predicate divinity to them because of them participating in the Trinity, them being the language I would say is them being of this part-whole relationship. So I would say the Father could be described and have Yahweh language applied to him if he's not identical to the Trinity, for the same reason that I think Yahweh language can be applied to the Son, even if he's not identical to Yahweh. It's because of the part-whole relationship that the person stands in to the Trinity, which is God. So let me maybe here's a way to think about this, right? So maybe here's where my concern is. When it comes to these Yahweh language passages, I see kind of 4 ways that we could interpret things. So one way is to say that when Yahweh language is applied to the Son and the Father, but those are both identity statements. I think neither one of us wants to affirm that, right? Because that would collapse the persons. I think we're on the same page with that. Okay, so we're not going to do that one, right? So then we have the option of saying that only one of these. We have 2 options, which would be saying only one of these is an identity statement, and the other one is metonymical, predicative, whatever. You could say that the Father is the identity statement and the Son is metonymical, or you could flip that and say that the Son is metonymical, or the Son is identity, the Father is predicative. I think it'd be really weird to say that the Son is the one who's an identity statement and the Father's. I think we'd agree that'd be kind of wacky. So I would remove that option as well.
Yeah.
So it seems like the 2 options that we have on the table is we could say the Father is identity while the Son is metonymical, or we could just say neither one of these is identity statements. Both of them are spoken in a metonymical or a predicative sense or something like that. And so it seems like for your argument to work, what you would need to do is you would need to remove the plausibility of taking the option that neither one of these is identity statements. So that's kind of where maybe that'll help
Okay, so the whole reason I brought up Craig and his model is because that was an example of how a metonym could arise from a part-whole relationship. And metonyms and the meaning of that concept was what we had just talked about. And the very issue we were discussing was, is metonyms and metonymical statements, that's something that is just about representation and mediation, which is what Josh seemed to be suggesting with his misrepresentation of me. In that clip you just saw, I just pointed out that metonymical or predicative statements can come about because of the part-whole relationship. I used Craig's model of the Trinity as an example to help, Josh understand where I was coming from. And I also outlined 4 different ways that Scripture could be interpreted. To be clear, that is 4 ways that we could understand what the original author meant in their statements. I was not at this point coming out of left sphere and comparing Josh's model of the Trinity to mine. At this stage in the conversation, everything was explicitly about what does the word metonymical mean and how do we apply that concept in interpreting Scripture. And this is crucial because this is where the conversation changes. Consider how Josh responds here.
I've got to be honest, that's very easy. So just let me get you right. So you're saying in your position that Yahweh is the Trinity. Is that what you're saying? And then you can predicate the term or the name Yahweh to the Father or the Son because the Father and the Son are parts of the Trinity. Is that what you're saying, if I'm correct?
So just to be clear, so I think there are 2 plausible ways, and I think there was very little. So I think I outlined 2 plausible positions that Mike could take. One you could say is that the Father is Yahweh. Like this is what you're saying. I could take that position and I could say the Son is a part of the Father, right? I could do something like that. In which case, if you were right, I would go with that, option, right? And then we could have a talk there. But then the other way I could go is I could go the way that I think guys like Kirshner, Craig, Haskell, like they go. And they don't want to go with that identifying the Father as Yahweh. They want to keep it more of like it's the Trinity that's Yahweh. So right now, right, I'm operating under this framework of like someone who wants to say the Trinity is Yahweh. That's what I'm operating under.
Okay.
And this is why I clarified that my position doesn't hinge on this, but I think yours does. And so this is, I think, a good position.
So notice here that Josh had just explicitly asked me what my position was, and I clarified what it was. Up to this point, we have been doing exegesis. I have been asking Josh to justify his assumptions, and I had to clarify to Josh how one could say that the Father is Yahweh in a metonymical sense. And I gave the example of how metonyms can be used in part-whole relationships, which is something we do in our everyday language all the time. Then after doing that, Josh explicitly asked me what my model of the Trinity is. And as I just said, everything I just said, because Josh explicitly asked me about it. Okay, I know you say, why is James harping on this? This is going to become important. Now notice what Josh does here, okay?
James, I've got to be honest. I think your position is incoherent. And I'm going to explain why.
Biblically or philosophically?
Philosophically, but because what you were saying is you need to remove the plausibility of that option, and then it leaves my option on the table. And I'm just saying to you that I believe that can be done very easily.
Biblically, you can do that?
No. So you said plausibility. Now, plausibility.
No, I meant like exegetically, like it is a plausible exegetical option to take that. Like that's what I'm referring to there.
Yeah, but the issue that you have is if yours is incoherent at the beginning, then there's no point even doing any exegetical work. And what I'm saying is I believe that your position is incoherent. And can I just spell out very quickly?
Yeah, just to be clear, my position is that neither one of these statements in the New Testament, either Yahweh language about the Father, Son, neither of those is identity statements. That's what you're saying is incoherent.
Okay. No. So just to get what I'm saying with your position,
So notice what Josh just did here. He just comes out the gate swinging about how my model of the Trinity is philosophically incoherent. Whether my model of the Trinity is coherent or not is not what was under the discussion here. Josh has explicitly agreed and said he wanted to only talk about my model of the Trinity after we got through my objections, which I told him would be primarily biblical. Yet here, Josh, out of nowhere, he just starts attacking my model of the Trinity. And I asked him multiple times, is he attacking me on biblical grounds or philosophical grounds? Josh explicitly affirms that he's attacking me on philosophical grounds. This was not the topic. And so I clarified to Josh that I had just been talking about exegesis up to this point. That is what I was talking about. How does the scriptural passages themselves, how could they be interpreted? I made that abundantly clear. Yet Josh doubles down on attacking my model because he thinks that if he can show that my model is philosophically incoherent, then he doesn't even need to do any work when it comes to justifying his inconsistent reading of Scripture. Now, the reason that I'm harping on this section so much is that when Josh did this, he's just blatantly abandoned the agreed upon structure of this conversation. This turned into a massive rabbit trail, and after we went on this rabbit trail, and when I tried to pull Josh back on topic, he accused me of being unwilling to defend my model. So Josh agreed to have a certain structure of conversation with me. He blatantly deviated from that structure, and then when I tried to get him to go back to the structure we'd agreed upon, he accused me of not defending my model and kind of chided me and stuff like that. And he tried to get us to stay on the rabbit trail. So now I publicly called Josh out on this after the debate, and I posted, pictures of the conversation that he had with me where he agreed to have this certain format. And Josh, I think, tried to save face by making this kind of defense of himself. This is what Josh says. Josh said in a comment, "The reason, James, that I objected to your view at that specific point of the dialogue was not to divert from the agreed upon structure, which I had no problem with, but because when I responded to you with exegetical reasons in the New Testament for affirming my model, you then brought in 4 alternative interpretive models for how one could interpret the passages that I had brought up. You then negated 2 of them and left my model's interpretation and yours. And so you, rather than I, had brought your model onto the table for analysis alongside mine at this specific point of the dialogue. And so I was showing how your model, the only other interpretive model you said is available, is not a viable option and is incoherent / theological problematic by committing oneself to a reified being over and above the persons that potentially possesses properties, and virtue of having the persons as parts they should not be taken to have. Also, interacting with your model by raising an objection against it after you reduce the available options to 2 candidates, yours and mine, is a standard way of analyzing disjunctive options called proof by elimination." Now, in light of what we all just saw, that is just false. The 4 interpretive models I brought up here was me explaining to Josh how the exegesis of a certain passage could have gone. I explicitly clarified this to Josh, and Josh still doubled down on launching a philosophical attack on me at this point. When I mentioned those 4 interpretive models, those were not attached to any specific model of the Trinity. Those were just ways we could understand what was going on in Paul's head or in John's head. I made it abundantly clear that this is what I was talking about and this is what I was doing both before and after Josh tried to shift the conversation. Now, notice that Josh says in this, quote, "So you, rather than I, had brought your model onto the table for analysis alongside mine at this specific point of the dialogue," end quote. No, I did not. I explained the concept of metonyms to Josh by using Craig's model as an example, because a part being referred to with the same language as the whole is a metonym. At no point in doing that was I bringing my model of the Trinity onto the table for analysis. I was trying to get Josh to understand what it was that I was even saying, since Josh had just blatantly misrepresented my position. Josh misrepresenting me is going to be a theme that pops up throughout this discussion. And then to make it even more clear of what the actual issue was, I gave 4 exegetical options for understanding the passages that Josh was cited. These were not models of the Trinity being compared. These were ways that we might understand what the original authors would have meant. And I made it explicitly clear that this is, what was going on. This is what my objection to Josh was about. I then explicitly clarified to Josh, again, this is what I was doing. It is after all of this that Josh straight up says, "I don't need to do exegesis if I can show that your model is incoherent." Josh, he just needs to straight up admit what he did here. If you think that Josh is a leg, to stand on, I would encourage you to go back and play that last clip that I just played for you, right? Go back and listen to it carefully and note how many times I explicitly communicate to Josh that I am talking exegetically here, and I get him to clarify whether or not he is, attacking me philosophically or exegetically. I clarified at least 3 different times, and Josh just doubles down on this. Now, Josh points out that I agreed to let him present his argument here, and he is right. I did agree to do that, and I shouldn't have. I went into this conversation with the highest intention of being kind and respectable and charitable. And in that charitability, I let Josh deviate from the agreed upon structure. I let him talk. And I should have been more strict. But I do point out to Josh that he has done this multiple times throughout this discussion. Like I point him out that he's going off trail here, and I call him out on this in the discussion. There reaches a point where I'm like, okay, let's get back on track. And I think I have some clips of that to show later. And here's a fun fact for everybody. I have done live discussions / debates like this a couple times. Here's the thing with these. No matter how firm you try to be with people or how charitable you try to be, it's really a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Because if I cut Josh off and I say stay on topic, I come across as rude, and people accuse me of running, and then Josh mocks me for not being willing to defend my model. If I don't cut Josh off and I make him stay on topic, he drags the conversation off topic, and then we don't have the conversation that I specifically thought we came to have. And I've had this exact issue when talking to people on TikTok. If I stay on top of people and I pull teeth, I'm a jerk. If I don't stay on topic with people, or if I don't stay on top of people and hold their feet to the fire, then they derail the conversation. And what's funny is later in this debate, I start to stay more on top of Josh, and that is when everybody gets mad at me and says I'm a jerk, right? A lot of people have complained about me being uncharitable in this dialogue with Josh, but if you think that that's the case, I would encourage you to go and find me being uncharitable to Josh up to this point in the conversation. I bend over backwards to let Josh finish his thoughts or expound on his arguments. It is only after repeated tomfoolery by Josh that I start to get more snarky and short with him. And I'm not saying that as that morally justifies my shortness or snark. You could make an argument that it's still morally unjustified or wrong. That's fine. I'll hear those arguments. But it's worth keeping in mind that it's only after repeated attempts to get Josh back on track and him just fighting me on it that is what occurs. So anywho, let's get back on topic, right? So something I've noticed throughout rewatching this debate is that I think Josh is very imprecise in his arguments. He will start, or he's kind of sloppy. He's kind of slippery with his arguments. He will start to argue one thing with me, but then when I ask a clarifying question, he backs out of what he was saying. Let me give you an example. So shortly after the clip I just showed you, Josh says this.
No,
The
no,
one
no, no,
Yahweh.
no, no, I didn't say that because
Okay.
I do agree with you. Theos is an ambiguous term, and I've always said that
Okay.
in my writings, my presentations. And what I normally say is at least there are two ways of understanding this. There's many different ways of understanding it. But when it's using the term the one or the God, ho theos,
Okay.
you're saying whatever being that is referred to as ho theos is different to the being that's referred to as Yahweh.
Okay, so notice what Josh has just said. He draws attention to when it says the one or the God, ho theos, ho being the definite article in the Greek. So Josh has at this point differentiated the scripture saying theos and it's saying ho theos, ho being the definite article. So Josh seems to be implying that there's something significant about this definite article. Yet when I ask him specifically about this, this is what he says in response to me.
So, sorry, could you run that by me? I have a quick question. Is it your position that ho theos is always Yahweh the Father? Is that your position?
No, there are very, I would say,
Okay.
a handful of passages that applies to this.
Okay, so you mentioned the definite article there. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't what you were saying.
So why is Josh harping on the definite article if he himself admits that Jesus is referred to with the definite article? There are numerous times throughout this debate where it seems like I struggle because he seems to be arguing for one thing or suggesting one thing, but then when I question him about that and restate it back to him, he abandons what he seems to be saying. Okay, so after that, Josh asked me what person I think is usually being referred to by Yahweh in the Old Testament, and I say that I think the person that is usually in mind in the Old Testament when Yahweh is mentioned, I think that's actually the Son is usually in mind. And Josh acts very flabbergasted by this idea, and he seems to get confused. So consider this clip.
That's the Father. Okay.
Yeah,
now, when Yahweh is spoken of in the Old Testament, who is that picking out?
So this is actually going to be one of my other areas that I want to talk with you about is Old Testament data, but I'll bracket most of it. I'll answer your question, and I'll bracket most of it. I think very often. Yeah, what's up?
Just really quickly, in 10 minutes roundabout, we're probably going to just do some super chats because they're starting to pile up.
Yeah, that's cool.
And once you're done with this point, James, it might be helpful for you guys just to quickly recap what happened in this conversation so far for the audience, because we've gone, the broad category is still here, but we're overlapping on a lot of technicalities here.
Okay, yeah.
So to help people track, let's after this part.
Okay, yeah. So when you look at Yahweh and how it's used in the Old Testament, like so if there's a figure that's being spoken of or a person that's being spoken of and the word Yahweh is being used, there are numerous instances where we know the person being labeled as Yahweh is the Son, the second person of the Trinity. And this is my second objection. I'm really confident that we can conclude that, and I think actually patristic tradition is gonna demand that of you if you're want to hold a patristic tradition. But I'll bracket most of my comments of that. But Yahweh in the Old Testament is at least sometimes referring to the Son.
Primarily, who is it referring to? Because I'm not asking who is it sometimes useful. When we are speaking about, when we have, for example, the Shema being spoken of in the Old Testament and being given, who is that referring to?
I think if you had to pick, if I had to say who is the prime person that's being referred to as Yahweh, and like who do the authors most often have in mind, I think they're most often thinking about the Son.
James, I've got to be honest,
I can justify
I'm
that.
confused about your position because
you can give me a raised eyebrow. That's not a refutation.
no,
I can clarify on that.
No, I'm just saying I'm just really confused about what your position is. So
Okay, so I want to highlight a couple things here. First, I explicitly telegraphed to Josh and to Than in this clip and to the audience that I want to address Old Testament data, and that is one of my objections, but I'm bracketing my comments on that. Now, I want to explain why I said what I just said. If I was to ask an Israelite, who is Yahweh? Or, hey, tell me about Yahweh, or tell me about what Yahweh has done for you. What are they going to say? What are the major things, right? The major things that are likely going to come to mind are things like Yahweh's covenant with Abraham, Yahweh speaking to Moses at the burning bush, Yahweh leading the people out of Egypt, right? So on and so forth. Those are all foundational aspects of an Israelite's conception of Yahweh. But those were all instances where we know that the Son was involved and speaking to the people because those are instances in which Yahweh is visible, and we know nobody has seen the Father according to the New Testament. And I'm going to agree with Jesus when he says that the whole of the Torah speaks about him. I'm going to say that in a really full sense, right? And so Josh kind of clutches his pearls and he acts confused, but this is what the biblical data I think suggests. And this is what I would say the earliest Christians understood to be the case. So this little kind of game that Josh wants to play where he thinks that he can just say, oh, Yahweh is primarily a reference to the Father throughout the scripture. What I'm going to say is that that game can only be played if one ignores all the Old Testament data where Jesus is referred to as Yahweh. Now, right after this, Josh engages with another blatant misrepresentation of me. Notice what he says shortly after this.
What is actually your position? Who is the being? Because you would say, for me, I'm confused because you're saying to me, okay, Yahweh is the Son.
So Josh just portrays me as identifying the Son with Yahweh, which I emphatically reject. I made this really explicit in my opening statement. Now, shortly after this, I again telegraph to Josh and Than that my next objection is related to Old Testament data. I make that clear. That is the direction I want to go with my objections. Listen to what I say here.
You say that throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament as a whole, Yahweh picks out the Father. What I'm going to say is absolutely not. Like, that is not tenable. And the only way you can make that claim is because you were just selectively ignoring the numerous instances in which we know it cannot be the Father. It cannot be the Father that appears to Abraham in Genesis 18. It cannot be the Father that appears to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3. It cannot be the Father that enters into the covenant between the pieces with Abraham. Like, all of those, which are foundational points in the story of Israel and their understanding of who Yahweh is, all of those are going to be the Son. And again, that is well represented in the patristic literature. And I know that's like we're cracking the lid of a big thing there. And so if Than wants to pause here, I have a lot of Old Testament data I would love to talk with you about. And I tell you what, let's let Josh have the last word on this. Since I started the attack, let's let Josh have the last word, and then we can go to questions. Does that seem fair?
Okay, so this is the second time I have said I want to talk about Old Testament data. That is my next set of objections. And I'm trying to be fair and keep stuff self-contained so as not to just kind of like gish gallop, Josh here. Now, shortly after this, I confirm for a third time that I want to talk about this Old Testament data and theophanies with Josh. Here's a clip of that.
I will say this because this can get really deep in the weeds really quickly if we're gonna get into like the Hebrew Bible, with the theophanies. I don't know if you guys want to go there or not, but
I fully plan to go there.
Okay. Well, let's get to some super chats here, then you guys can jump back in.
Really quickly. Because we went over biblical data, largely speaking, and the identity statements and all that kind of stuff. Are you guys wanting to continue that conversation, or are you wanting to go into like a different broad category here?
I would like to continue that conversation in light of Old Testament data because so far I think we've mainly focused on New Testament stuff. But I think when we look at Old Testament data, I think, and we take Old Testament data in light of its ancient Near Eastern context, I think it becomes more damning for Josh. I'll just be honest. I'll be upfront, right? I think that, so far my main argument has been like, hey, listen, this distinction isn't justified. I think there's some stuff in the Old Testament as it relates to the Yahweh language that is going to make this position by Josh harder. So I want to press you, right? I want to bring this up. Now, some of it I can cut out because it's relevant to what we've talked about, and then I can maybe skip to the part that's like more newer.
Now, after that statement, Josh clarifies his position, and he says this.
And so what I'm saying is that the Father, firstly, what I started with, the Father is explicitly called the Lord. Okay. So he is explicitly called Kyrios. Now, when it's applied to him, what does that mean? Is that used as a name for him? Is that used as an identity statement for him? Is that used metonymically in a representative format, that the Father is representing something else? When the Son is called Kyrios, again, he's called Kyrios a lot more than the Father. Is that used as an identity for him? Is that used metonymically as a representative? I am trying to say...
Notice that Josh again connects metonyms with representation. This is the exact issue I addressed earlier. Metonyms are not strictly about representation. They can be. Metonyms occur when X is called by the same name as Y because of an association that X has with Y. That association doesn't have to be representative. It could be that the association which warrants the metonym is a part-whole association. For instance, if I spend time with my brother, I say I hung out with my family. My brother is part of my family, he has that association with my family, and so because of that association, I can refer to him as my family, despite the fact that my family is more than just my brother, right? Now, saying that I can call my brother my family in a metonymical sense does not mean that I am therefore saying my brother is the representative for my entire family. Josh just keeps misunderstanding the nature of metonymical statements. He thinks that if he can show that Jesus is a representative of the Father, then it must be the case that the Father must be Yahweh in an identity sense and Jesus only in a metonymical sense. That just doesn't follow. Now, after this, Josh asked to go to one more verse in the New Testament to help make his case, and I say, sure, right, let's do it. And the verse he goes to is Philippians 2, right, the least controversial passage in the entire New Testament. So Josh asked me how I understand the passage about the Father giving his name to Jesus, the name that's above every name, so on and so forth, towards the end of Philippians 2 there. And I give a little spiel, and then this interaction occurs in this clip that you're about to see. It's a little under 4 minutes, but I think it's worth showing in full. As you watch this, I want you to think to yourself, does James ever simply dismiss the scholar that Josh cites? Think about that, okay? Have in your mind, how does James respond to the scholarship that Josh brings forward? Do I incorporate it into the conversation and I take it seriously? Do I just dismiss it and say, oh, that's just one scholar, that's not enough to build your case? Do I say, scholars are lame? Like, how do I engage with that? And then we'll look at this 4-minute clip, which I think is it's worth showing in full.
When Richard Borkham says, the name that is above every name given to the exalted Jesus is Yahweh, not Lord, which is not the divine name, but a conventional Greek substitute for the name. And I can give you the reference for that later if you want. So yeah. When Borkham, do you disagree with Borkham there then? When Borkham says that it's actually Yahweh?
So here's the thing. Do you think that this is at the exaltation, is this the first time that Jesus has that name? Because if so, well, that means the angel didn't have the Yahweh's name in him in the angel of the Lord passages. That means Jesus wasn't making Yahweh's name known to us when he was here on earth before his resurrection and ascension. So I think if you understand, it's giving him his name in the sense of like Yahweh is proclaiming this status that Jesus has, and it's like maybe vindicating his possession of.
It doesn't say that. I mean,
that's what I think.
That's like a wrangling out of this. Like, let me get
Josh,
out of
if
this.
You deny this, you're going to have trouble accounting for the divinity.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
I understand what
this isn't a my position thing. This is in general as Christians with the divinity of Christ. If you deny that Jesus had the name of Yahweh before the exaltation, we've all got problems.
But all I'm saying, I mean, Borkham must see that as well then, because he's literally saying explicitly that it's the name Yahweh that's given there, not Kyrios.
I mean, I can grant that. Yeah, I can grant that.
So what I'm saying to you is it's literally saying he's giving him the name above all names.
Cool.
What name could that be? Like, it doesn't seem to be a status. It doesn't seem to be an attribute he's giving.
Do you think the name is just a title? I'm struggling to see how this supports your position.
All I'm saying, because what I'm saying, if it is an identity statement, it's not something that's given to someone. So
About
So
Jesus having the name?
the name Yahweh.
I
So
don't think that when it says Jesus is given the name, I don't think that that is setting up like a numerical identity statement in the language
no,
of
but you got to
like
understand my
philosophical
position.
theology.
Remember
Yeah.
what my position is. My position is like he is Yahweh by representation. The
But
Father
not
is
actually
Yahweh.
Yahweh.
The Father is Yahweh by identity. So if he's Yahweh by identity, then he's not given that. If he's Yahweh by representation, he can be given that.
Oh,
So
okay, but wait,
if
wait.
it's saying that Jesus is given the name that's above all names, then I'm asking you, please, how
Wait,
could Yahweh
this
be a name for identity?
I don't think Jesus is at that moment being given an identity statement with Yahweh. And I could say that Jesus is not
No,
being
he
given an
can't be. It
identity
doesn't make
statement.
Let
sense
me.
to be given an
Yeah,
identity statement.
I don't think you understand my position, and I don't think you're arguing in a cohesive or tight manner. So I think that everything you're saying about the Father gives the name, like however we want to cash that out, to Jesus, that gives Yahweh to Jesus, like in that scenario, I can affirm that and still affirm that the Father does not have like this type of like numerical identity like correlation with the Father, like this just strict identity thing. Like I can understand this as the Father like exalting Jesus, like proclaiming he has his name, like so on and so forth. I can say all that. Do you think, let me ask you this, do you think prior to Jesus's exaltation, do you think he bore Yahweh's name? Yes or no?
No, I do. I do.
Okay,
But
so then you don't think
no,
this
no,
is
because
literally Jesus giving this name that he didn't already
what I'm
have?
trying to get to here, what I'm trying to get is we have put let's say inclinations towards a position that there is a mediatorial role.
I don't deny that, Josh. I
One
agree.
second.
So several things are worth noting here. First, notice that in this clip, I never just rejected or dismissed Baucham's statements. I never just said, oh, that's only one scholar, I don't care. My response to the quote by Baucham is cool, I can agree with that. But what I'm trying to get Josh to reflect on is, what does it mean to say that Jesus is given the name Yahweh? But later in the conversation, when I cite a scholar to argue against Josh, this is what he says about how I responded to that quote by Baucham. You just heard me respond to that quote by Baucham by saying, "Okay, cool, I can agree with that." Right now, look at how Josh represents me as responding to that citation from Baucham roughly an hour later in this conversation.
So you cited one scholar, and the same way that you dismissed Baucham's point of Yahweh being given, the Son being given the name Yahweh at that point, I can dismiss the same thing with yours. You gave one scholar.
Okay, so from these two clips that I've just shown you back to back, you can see that Josh blatantly misrepresented me. And based on these clips, you can see that, Josh misrepresenting me throughout this dialogue is somewhat of a recurring theme. Now, more on topic to the issue at hand, there is an issue with this passage that Josh is appealing to, that every Christian has to wrestle with, regardless of your model of the Trinity, regardless of if you even hold to the Trinity. In this passage, Jesus is depicted as being given the name of Yahweh after his exaltation or at his exaltation, right? But elsewhere in Scripture, Jesus is depicted as having Yahweh's name before the exaltation. How do we deal with that? How do we understand that issue? And how we understand that issue? It seems important to Josh's argument. Josh wants to say, oh, look, the Father gives Jesus a name at the exaltation. This must be in a metonymical sense. So all the times where Jesus is called Yahweh, it can also be a metonymical sense. And then also, for some reason, all the times that the Father is called Yahweh, that's an identity sense. Like that's another part of this, that it seems like Josh is here trying to make an argument for why the Son can't be identified with Yahweh, but that's never been my position. That seems to be another area that he's misrepresenting me on. This would be an argument maybe for the Son being understood metonymically, but it wouldn't be an argument for the Father being understood in an identity sense. But anyways, what I'm trying to get Josh to see here is that it just doesn't follow, because if Jesus is given Yahweh's name as a metonymical sense only at the exaltation, then that would not explain all the Old Testament passages or all the New Testament passages where Jesus bears Yahweh's name before the exaltation. exaltation. So I provide a way of understanding this passage, which is that this is speaking of the Father declaring Jesus as Yahweh and vindicating him at the exaltation and affirming that he bears and has always borne that name. And that explanation seems to be the best way to reconcile what is said in Philippians and what is said elsewhere in Scripture. That seems to indicate that even before the exaltation, Christ bore the name of Yahweh. And again, Josh keeps coming back to this idea of mediation, as if that is the subject at hand, and I keep having to correct him that that is not the issue. And I think it is really apparent throughout these discussions that Josh is playing very fast and very loose with the biblical data, and his argument cannot bear the weight that he wants it to bear. But Josh has a strategy for how to avoid this issue. He is going to try to shift the burden of proof onto me, and we'll go ahead and see how Josh tries to shimmy his way out of the burden of proof that he has placed on himself and tries to put it on me.
As well, at the beginning of our discussion, that when, for example, in the Annunciation, the Lord is referring to the Father. So can you then show me where I should not take that as an identity for the Father? Because I say I have ground for taking the Lord to not be an identity for the Son.
But when you do that, you're shifting the burden of proof. I don't have to give the argument for why you can't take that as an identity statement. You're putting this forth as an argument, so you have to give the argument that it is an identity statement.
Then
now, but wait, no, let me finish. Let me finish.
But
here's let me finish. You seem to be sourcing the justification of this identity statement in this type of contingency between Jesus having this name in whatever sense it is, and the Father being the one who gives him this name. However, I could grant that, okay, there's a contingency between Jesus having this name, which again, I don't think it's like him having this name in the sense of like any sense whatsoever, because that would again be really problematic. I could grant that there's this contingency here, and I could still say, okay, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, they are all parts of the one God. And I would point out that that is a view taken by guys like Hasker or Kirshner. They're going to affirm that there's a contingency relationship between, or dependency between the Son and the Father, and they're still going to grant that, like,
now what I want to do.
Notice what he just said there. He said, show me where I should not take this as an identity statement for the Father. When he says that, he is now shifting the burden of proof. He's saying, hey, James, you give me an argument that this is not an identity statement, but I don't have to do that. Josh has made the argument that this is an identity statement. And what I'm saying is, I don't see any reason to think that this is the case. And Josh's response can't just be, oh yeah, well, prove to me it isn't. That's not how arguments work. You can't just declare that something is the case, and when somebody questions you on it, say, prove to me the opposite, and that be some type of sufficient justification for your position. Now, I point this out to Josh, and I point out to Josh that this thing he's harping on, which is the contingency of the name, that doesn't bolster his exegetical claims about the Father being identified with Yahweh here. The only reason I reference those scholars that I just point to is that to say that one could affirm the contingency of the Son on the Father in whatever way. So you could say, the Father is contingent on the Son and that he gets the name from him. You could say that the Son is contingent on the Father and that the Father grounds his existence. You could do all that. And that is not going to be exegetical grounds to say that the Father is what is identified with Yahweh. Because you could say that Yahweh is identical to the Trinity, and you could say that the one part of the Trinity generates or has this contingency relationship with this other part of the Trinity. You could say that and still say that it's the Trinity as the whole, which is Yahweh. And by referencing those scholars I just referenced, I'm not here pulling out my model and setting it on the table and comparing his to mine and saying mine is better. I am just pointing out that the thing he is harping on can be found under other models which reject his exegetical claims of identity statements about the Father. So here, Josh again decides to take philosophical swipes at my model of the Trinity, and this ends up being the beginning of the meat of our philosophical discussions. So I'm going to play a pretty decent chunk clip. I think this is about 6 minutes, and then we can talk about it and see what goes down here. So let's go ahead and play that clip.
So the Trinity is Yahweh. The Son can be called Yahweh and the Father can be called Yahweh because they're parts of the Trinity. Is that accurately representing that position?
I think that's a pretty decent representation.
Okay. Now, my question to you would be so let's say we have the Trinity. The Trinity bears the property being Yahweh.
Being identical to Yahweh, yeah.
Or just say being Yahweh, just for easy for the audience.
Okay.
Being Yahweh, okay? And then the Father and the Son have this property as well because they're parts of the Trinity. Yes?
They can be called Yahweh because of the
so they have the properties of being Yahweh. So what we have is property transfer between wholes and parts. But then the problem that you have,
It's not property transfer. I'm not saying the Father, Son, Holy Spirit have the same property that the Trinity as a whole does. I'm
I
saying
didn't
they
say that.
have. Okay, I'm just making sure that. Okay, I'm just
I'm
making
just
sure that's
saying in
clear.
that
Yeah.
specific sense
Okay,
of
gotcha.
being Yahweh is transferred from the whole to the parts. Yes.
But so long as being Yahweh is understood, because I don't think the Father, in my view, in this one that we're talking about here, it wouldn't be the case that the Son is Yahweh in the sense that the Trinity is Yahweh. So it's not that that property is then being
Yes.
transferred to the Son.
Okay.
I want to make sure we're clear
Okay.
on that. Yeah.
Now my question would be is what is your principle for property transfer here? Because if you're happy to say that the Trinity can bear the name Yahweh and the parts, the Father and Son can have it because they're parts of it, what is your principle to stop other properties from going from the parts to the whole? So, for example, the Father is a person, the Son is a person. Do you believe that the Trinity is a person?
So I don't think that the Trinity is intrinsically a person. So for instance, someone like Chad McIntosh has argued that like Trinitarians could think about God as like a group person in which you have three intrinsic persons who constitute one group person. But setting that aside, like it seems like your argument is, hey James, if you let there be like this transfer of properties in one sense, like if you grant like, okay, these guys have these properties in one sense, therefore they have that in virtue of the part-whole relationship. Therefore, just any part. Therefore, that's going to lead to this kind of.
No. I didn't say that to you.
Okay, so then set up your argument because
what I was saying to you very clearly is that what's your principle to stop certain properties from moving from the parts to the whole? Because you say that the whole bears a property that the parts have. Okay, so
no, I explicitly denied that. I don't think you're listening. I explicitly denied that. Yeah.
This might be helpful, Josh. Can you, and maybe I'm just off in understanding what possibly your argument might be here, but can you give an example to James about what one property is from a part to a whole that he would want to limit? That would almost be like a counterexample to what he wants to. You get what I'm trying to say?
So I was just saying very clearly that you don't want to say that, for example, the Trinity is a person. Even if you say functional, I've read McIntosh's paper. Number one, the majority of philosophers don't believe that groups are persons. So it's a very, very controversial position that's taken to defend a controversial position, which is.
I agree that's controversial.
Okay.
Sure. I don't have to.
And it's very implausible, secondly.
Yeah, I don't think the Trinity is a literal person. Yeah.
Yes, but I'm trying to ask you, if you hold to your position, you have no non-arbitrary principle to say that on the one hand, we can transfer Yahweh, the property of being Yahweh, to the parts. So we can call the Father Yahweh, we can call the Son Yahweh, because the whole is called Yahweh. But then on the other hand, you can't. How can you stop the properties that the parts have from going to the whole?
Okay. So I think I understand. You seem to think that if I call a part Yahweh, because it's a part of Yahweh as a whole, that oh boy, I've got this big trouble because now this is going to let the cat out of the bag, and now I'm going to have to be consistent. I'm just going to have to say everything that's referred to every property that I would ascribe to a part has to go to a whole. I say this is nonsense. We talk about. Wait, I want to make clear. That does seem to be your argument.
No, it's not, because that would be the fallacy of division, and that would be the fallacy of composition. So I'm not holding to that. What I'm saying to you is, give me a principle that stops those things from.
Okay, I'm trying to make sure I understand your argument. You're saying here, if I call the Son Yahweh, right? If I call him that, and I think it's okay to refer to him that, I think it makes sense to refer to the Son as Yahweh. And the reason I think it makes sense to refer to him as Yahweh is because of the part-whole relationship he stands in, right? I think it makes sense to refer.
That's what you said. Yes.
And what I would say is we do this all the time in our normal everyday language, right? If I was off screen and you could only see my arm, you might be like, oh, that's James. I see James's body. No, you don't. You only see part of James. Right now, you don't see my back. Are you seeing James? Or if I had, if you rolled up, if I rolled up in my car and maybe my car was like filled with, or it was covered in like bird poop, you would say, oh, James, your car is filthy. But no, like, when you're saying that, you're referring to a specific part of my car, namely my hood. If I went and I hung out with my brother this weekend, I would say I hung out with my family this weekend. If my aunt came next week and I hung out with her, I would say I hung out with my family next week. In both those instances, I did not hang out with the entirety of my family. I hung out with parts of them. And because that, we can have this part-whole language. If me and you go to a pool party and you see me chilling in the pool from, the shoulders up and I'm drinking a beer, you'd say, James is in the water already. But not all of James, only part of James. Like we use language of the whole to refer to
James, I'm
parts
not
all
debating
the
that.
time.
I'm not
No,
debating
but
that.
it is. It seems like you
You're
seem
not
to
answering
think
my
that if I
question.
do this, I'm just like going down this rabbit
Of course
hole.
not.
Okay, so I want to unpack what's going on here, right? So at this point, we have been talking about metonymical usage in the Bible and when is it used, and Josh wants to say that it makes sense to refer to Jesus as Yahweh because of the idea of metonymical language. And metonymical language, one thing is referred to with the name of another because of their association. So for Josh, the association that he harps on is the association of representation. For me, the association of importance is a pothole association. I think that one could refer to the Son or to the Father as Yahweh, even if they were only part of Yahweh. And I say, hey, Josh, this would be a normal use of language because we do this all the time. Like this is just really like normal, and this is the same type of logic that's like undergirding Josh's use of metonymical language. Like I'm just taking the idea of metonymical language, and I'm pointing out another area where this language is used, which is the association between parts and wholes. If this is normal for us, it seems like plausibly something similar could be going on in Paul's mind. So this seems like a live option on the table for what somebody like Paul might have meant with his Yahweh language. Or to put it another way, if Paul thought that Father, Son, Holy Spirit, if he thought that they were all parts of the one God, then it doesn't seem too surprising that he would refer to those parts with the language of the whole. And so we could just have a consistent interpretation for all the Yahweh language, regardless of whether it's applied to the Son or to the Father, right? Now it seems like in response, Josh is trying to say, I can't interpret a person as using metonymical language to refer to parts as wholes unless I can provide some philosophical principle for every conceivable property for why that property would not be transferred from the part to the whole. And I find this argument asinine. Like, this is insane. Imagine you and I were sitting at a bar and we hear somebody say, oh man, there's bird poop all over my car. You would probably not infer from that statement that there was bird poop on the steering wheel or the engine or inside the transmission. You would probably understand that statement as like the bird pooped on the top or outer portion of the frame or something like that, right? Like the roof of your car. Now imagine I told you, you cannot be justified in that interpretation of what you overheard unless you give me a philosophical principle by which, for every conceivable property, you can explain why a property would not transfer from the part to the whole. What? That's asinine. You don't need to do that to recognize that according to how our language is used in our everyday language, the person in question could reasonably be interpreted as just referring to part of their car with language of the whole. But for some reason, Josh thinks that I have to do this when it comes to what I overhear Paul talking about with the Corinthians or with the Philippians or so on and so forth. Josh is going to say it's not even a live option on the table that this might be what Paul meant unless I can give Josh this universal philosophical principle. Like, what? This seems like an argument born out of desperation and not rationality. And I want to point out something here, two things out, right? First, if Josh is going to demand this principle from me, I could turn around and I could do the same thing to him. Josh makes the claim that there is a property shared between the Father and the Son, which is that both can be called Yahweh. And Josh grounds this on the fact that the Son represents the Father. So I could turn to Josh and I could say, hey fam, in order to make that claim, you have to give me a principle which will, for every instance of one person representing another, apply to every possible property to ensure that the wrong properties don't get transferred. So I could play that game as well. Now, second, something I want to point out here is that if we're trying to see whether a property transfers from the part to the whole, it seems like this is going to come down to a case-by-case basis. And so I'm not sure that it makes sense to talk about some type of like universal principle here, or I mean, it would just at least be like needlessly, clunky. So suppose I have a toy truck composed of 3 parts. Each part is fully red. Is the whole going to share this property of being fully red? Yes, that is obvious, right? Now, suppose each part of the truck weighs 4 pounds. Is the whole going to have the property of weighing 4 pounds? No, it won't. We all together, you and I, we just, navigated. We navigated Josh's precarious road of property transfer. Everybody pat yourself on the back. We did it together, right? And we did it without first establishing some universal philosophical principle. Was this arbitrary? No, it wasn't. With most properties, it's going to be pretty easy to tell when the property transfers. And Josh admits that we can look at the property in question to navigate this, thus undercutting the need for some general principle. And so, for a variety of reasons, I just don't have to play Josh's game here. And that's my response to Josh, is to say, I don't need to do this. Josh wants to push this big philosophical burden on me, and I'm not going to accept. And Josh doesn't like the fact that I won't accept it. And so I explain this to Josh, and Josh says that I have no way to stop the property of personhood from transferring from the parts to the Trinity, thus making the Trinity a fourth person. Now, supposedly that's what's coming my way, but look at how I respond to this.
Arbitrary and just picking and choosing and saying, oh yes, Yahweh can be a property that's born by the parts, but personhood,
Josh,
I have no reason to say that it is.
Can I interrupt you? So right now we have 3 persons on the screen. Do you think all 3 of us constitute a new person?
Sorry?
Right now there are 3 persons on the screen.
Yes.
Do you think us 3, do you think we, us here, where we're standing in this porthole relationship to this live stream, right?
We're not in a porthole relationship.
On the screen, literally part of the screen is our different things. Like if we got together, if we were all hanging out, do you think us 3 hanging out in a group, do you think at that point, us 3, we would be an additional person?
That's not a good example.
That's literally the thing I think is going on with the Trinity.
I don't hold to unrestricted composition. So I don't just believe the plurality of things make a composite whole. There has to be certain forms and certain things that are in arrangement for these parts to make a whole. So actually, no, we wouldn't make a whole. And secondly, well, on a screen, it's not actually literally me being in a pothole relationship with that thing. So I'll give you an example. So if I'm walking down the street with you and Fan, okay, do we make up a whole?
And in that moment, no, but if me, you, and Fan were in a band and our name was like Satan and the Cosmic Baddies, at that point, we would be parts constituting a whole. Like we would be parts of the whole band. Like persons can stand in part-whole relationships to like a unified thing.
Yes, I do know that.
Okay, so at this point, I just gave an example in which multiple persons constitute a whole, and we don't say that the whole is another person. If we have a band with 3 members in it, we 3 people, we constitute the band. Or if we have a committee with like 12 members, we 12 people constitute a whole. The first example I gave was off the cuff and a bit of sloppy, but this band analogy I think hits the hammer on the head. The second thing I want to point out here is at this point, I'm trying to get the conversation back to what it's supposed to be about. Like, so shortly after I say this, I point out like, hey, we're really off track here. Can we get back to exegetical discussions? At this point, this is actually the second time that I've pointed out to Josh that we're off track, and I'm like, okay, look, this conversation is supposed to be me presenting exegetical objections to his model. This conversation is not about the nuances of my model. We explicitly agreed to save that until after I've been through my objections, so on and so forth. And I've only mentioned one objection, right? So if I want to get to my objections, this thing has to get brought back on track, right? So I am, like I get said, I think this is the second, shortly after I make these remarks, I explicitly go to, listen, we're really off track here. Can we get back to the exegetical stuff in this, conversation about like philosophical part-whole, property transfer. Now, after I say that, here's what the moderator says at that point. Okay, listen to this. But at this point, we're still way off of the exegetical issues that I've been pressing on you.
So
but you do understand.
I want to jump in here just really quickly.
I just say one?
I don't want to go in philosophical circles because this is only one of the potential models I have. I think we're going in circles.
Let me just jump really quickly in here. I can appreciate what you're saying, James. It by my understanding, we kind of collectively did agree to jump into the philosophical side of the discussion, though, because we're at the 1.5-hour mark at this point. If we were going to spend more time on the exegetical arguments, we probably would not have time to get into the philosophical.
Okay, so this comment by Than has caused me great frustration in the debate. As you can see right after that, my body language, you can see my frustration, and even after like rewatching this, it frustrates me. In this video that you are currently watching right now, right, this one that you're on, right, I have shown you 4 separate instances leading up to this moment where I explicitly state that the next objection I want to raise is about Old Testament data. And at this moment, Than says that we all agreed to move into the philosophical stuff. No. No, we most certainly did not. Not only that, it seems like Than is suggesting that for the sake of time, the exegetical discussions, they just need to be closed. We need to just move on. What? I came into this discussion with at least 3, maybe 4 exegetical objections, and at this point, we've talked about literally only one of them, and it's not even the one that I think is the most important. So at this moment, it's like I was having this wrestling match with Josh in this game of tug of war to get the conversation back to where it should be, to what we agreed upon. And then in this moment, Than walks up and he just hops on Josh's side and starts helping him pull the conversation away from the exegetical discussion that we had agreed upon, and I had, telegraphed that's where I planned to go next. And it's here I need to make some comments about Than, the moderator. Many of you know, Than is my boy, right? Me and Than are homies. And shortly after this conversation, me and Than, we hopped on a call together and we had a good long chat. And I was really upfront and honest about my frustrations about this. And Than was upfront and honest about some of his frustrations and disappointments that he had towards me. Me and Than are still good friends. We're still homies. I want to clarify that. And while I don't think Than is blameless in this scenario, I don't think all the blame can be laid on him. And I don't think this was on purpose on Than's part. I think there was a lot going on here. I think there were some miscommunications throughout the process of setting up this debate, this discussion, and I think this was just an honest mistake on Than's part. Me and Than agreed that we probably should have gone into this with more structure, and there were areas where both of us were like, I could have done a better job on communication or setting up structure, so on and so forth. I did tell Than about the format that me and Josh agreed upon, but I could have been more detailed. We probably should have all hashed out the specifics of the structure more going into this, and there were some kind of confounding factors that happened right before the debate started, where we didn't really have the time to talk about structure. So just to summarize this here, while this does frustrate me, I don't think Than should be getting super bashed for this. Now, with that said, this is how Josh responds to me trying to pull the conversation back to what Josh explicitly agreed upon, right? So in the next clip, I am pretty upfront about my frustration about all this, and you can see my frustration in my body language. Notice how Josh responds to this, though.
We probably would not have time to get into the philosophical.
Okay, then that just frustrates me, because when we organized this, Josh said, make a list of your objections that are the most central, bring those up, and then after we're done, he'll take swings on my view. I presented one of my exegetical problems, which is not even the most dire to his thing, and then he asked for us to go over here and to briefly talk about this. And now we're doing this, and this isn't even my main point. I could grant Josh all this, and it wouldn't even overcome what I see as to be the major problems with this thing. This is just one part of the exegetical data. So
James,
tell you what, yeah, go ahead.
But you have to understand how we've got to this point. It wasn't because I just randomly said, okay, let me start talking philosophical.
Yes, it is, Josh. That is exactly what you did. Remember, everybody, that clip I showed you earlier where he doubled down on shifting to a philosophical critiques despite my numerous attempts to clarify and ask him, is this a philosophical critique or is this an exegetical critique? I did that multiple times. I think there was 3, and he consistently doubled down on switching to a philosophical objection to me. And when I said, hey, listen, I'm talking exegesis here, his response was, I don't need to do the exegetical work if I can show your model is, incoherent in this way. So no, Josh, you were wrong. You straight up switched this conversation around the 45-minute mark or something like that. You did just up and switch this to a philosophical attack on the coherence of this aspect of my model of property transfer and things along those lines. So I'm fine if Josh wants to be like, oh, listen, I misunderstood where you were going, and my bad. But there reaches a point where I'm like, this almost feels like gaslighting, with Josh kind of retroactively making these narratives. And I'm not saying Josh is intentionally gaslighting, because I'm going to extend charity there, and I don't want to accuse him of doing something intentionally deceptive. But it feels almost as if he's gaslighting and trying to suggest that oh no, the things that you can see on your screen about how this conversation progressed, and the things you can see on what he agreed to in our messages, he's just trying to act like none of that ever happened. But anyways, let's keep going. So the next clip is about 43 seconds long. So let's go ahead and roll that and keep this thing going.
It's because you were saying that your position is another option someone could take as an interpretive position for what I've been saying. What I'm trying to say is I'm trying to close the door and say, no, it's not, because it's theologically tenuous to take your position.
And
That's
your
what I'm
argument for why it's theologically tenuous is that if I think that in any instance I can refer to a whole with the same name as, if I can refer to a part as the same name as the whole, and if there's ever an instance when I do that, then in order to do that, I have to come up with this like intense, like nuanced philosophical position of how in any instance I could ever make such a distinguishing. Like that seems to be your argument here.
You're obviously not representing what I said. What I'm just saying, I've said very easily, what is just your reasons that you would say that the whatever properties that the parts have, they are not transferring to the whole? Because if, for example, Craig himself took this position on himself, and he said that, the Trinity is really divine, and the Son and the Spirit are not divine. And so what he said is that he was giving a reason, because he was saying, well, actually, there's unique properties that are born by the Trinity, which are not had by the parts. What I'm trying to say to you,
that's what I said, Josh.
Okay,
when you started this.
Now, one second. So what I'm trying to say to you is, because you're allowing properties to flow from the whole to the parts.
I'm not properties, language. That's what I've been trying to get you to understand. It's not property. No. I'm saying we can use the same language that we refer to the whole, and we can take that language and apply it, because that's normally.
Okay, so Josh just massively blunders in this clip, right? So I want to point out a couple things here. First, if Josh admits that Craig's model is philosophically coherent, then he's lost the plot. Like he's has admitted defeat, because I explicitly draw on Craig in my dissertation when talking about my model of the Trinity. Craig's model is an instance of one of the models that I set up in the beginning in my opening statement. So it seems like Josh is saying, oh, Craig has avoided this by saying XYZ, but that's exactly what I did as well. So I'm utterly confused on what Josh's argument is here. But no, there's a second bigger thing here. Josh just blatantly misrepresented Craig in that clip, right? So if you need evidence that Josh doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to my position, if you need evidence that Josh doesn't even understand the position he's trying to critique when it comes to guys like William Lane Craig, okay, I'm going to show you a clip from that thing that we just saw. I'm gonna clip the statement where Josh explicitly says something about Craig, and then I'm going to read you a quote from Craig from my my dissertation, right? So here's the clip. This is what Josh just said. Remember?
Craig himself took this position on himself, and he said that, the Trinity is really divine, and the Son and the Spirit are not divine, and the Son and the Spirit are not divine.
Okay, now I'm going to read you a quote. This comes from my dissertation, and it's actually a shortened quote by Craig, but this is what it says. Craig says, we could think of the persons of the Trinity as divine because they are parts of the Trinity, that is, parts of God. Given that the Father, for example, is not the whole Godhead, it seems undeniable that there is some sort of part-whole relation obtaining between the persons of the Trinity and the entire Godhead. Now, that comes from Craig and Moreland's Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. That's the second edition, page 588. Actually, wait, that's page 590. And like I said, that's a bigger quote that I shortened a bit. But so Craig explicitly says the persons are divine, and they're divine because of the part-whole relationship that that they stand in. So not only is Josh seeming to not only is he blatantly misrepresenting Craig and not even understanding Craig's model of the Trinity, by putting this up and saying, oh, look, like Craig has even done this. Even Craig has, like dealt with this issue. Well, if Craig has dealt with it and you think that he's, like overcome this hurdle, then I should be good to go, because I explicitly pick up and run with Craig's model in my work. And I also want to point out, and listen, I've perused some of Josh's papers on monarchical Trinitarianism, and I don't see Josh bringing up this objection that he's bringing up with me with guys like Craig and Haskell. And listen, maybe I just missed the papers. If you are a Sijuwade fan and you know of a paper where he brings this up, by all means, I'm welcome to hear it. I haven't seen Josh bring up this objection in his written work against these guys. And if this is so problematic, Josh, if this makes my view so philosophically incoherent that you don't need to do any of the exegetical work, isn't it funny that you just never talk about this in all your other work where you're like trying to argue for your model of the Trinity? I don't think Josh knows what his own argument is here. I think Yeah, I mean, so like there are times where I think maybe I'm wrong, but then he says stuff like this, and I'm like, no, Josh just doesn't know what's up and what's down in this conversation, and I think he's just flying by the seat of his pants. And I'm not saying that to insult Josh. Josh is clearly a smart guy, but I think this statement is just abundant evidence that Josh just doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't understand my model of the Trinity. He has not taken care to understand the model of guys like William Lane Craig, and so I think this is a really damning statement by Josh in here. Here's what's funny. So Josh has spent all this time objecting to my suggestion that parts can be referred to with language of the whole, and how this just is not even a live option on the table, right? Now, Josh was seeking to show that we could therefore remove this, possibility from the exegetical, interpretive table or whatever, because it's just so darn incoherent. But then when I ask him point blank, this is what he says.
I want to ask you a question. Like,
Yes.
do you agree with me that there are instances in which it is appropriate to refer to a part with the same language we refer to the whole as?
Yes.
Okay, so like that is the essence of my point. I'm just saying in general, I think that there is plausibility in saying we can talk about and label the Son as Yahweh, because there are instances in which we can refer to a part with the same type of language as a whole. And in saying that, and just recognizing, hey, this is something we do in our everyday language, that does not commit me to saying that all parts, all properties of parts can be transferred to the whole, or vice versa. That does not commit me. But before I can affirm the truth of that statement, I don't need to sit down and write a dissertation on when and under what circumstances we can use this type of language. And so that's what I'm trying to convey to you. It's like in general, I can say, like as we both agreed, I can refer to parts with whole language. That is normal stuff we do in our everyday lives. And so if I do that with the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, if I did that, I wouldn't be doing anything like untenable that we don't already do in our everyday language. Like this is how we talk colloquially.
Okay.
So in the beginning part of this clip, Josh admits that this is something like we do. Like this is like normal, right? So it sure does seem like when we read through Paul, this is a live option on the table for maybe what was going on in Paul's head, which is like that's what like this whole thing has been about. Or it's like, what is the original intent of the author? What was the original intent of the author? Was the original author trying to set up an identity statement between the Father and Yahweh? Or could Paul have been referring to the Father as Yahweh in a metonymical sense because of this part-whole relation, right? So, but Josh tries to clap back at me here, and he uses just insanely sloppy logic. Look at what Josh says here.
And so, in our everyday language, can we refer to the whole with the language that we say of the parts?
Refer to the whole with the language. Well, that would just follow from the other thing. If I can refer to a part with the language of the whole,
can we do that? Yes.
Yeah, if we refer to the part with the language of the whole, then we can do that.
So then, answer then. Why is the whole not a person then? Why is the Trinity not a person?
How does that question follow? How does me saying that sometimes parts and wholes share language suddenly present this question? No, I gotta figure out, well, how is it the case then that the Trinity isn't a person? Like, how does one thing lead to another? In one instance, we are talking about what terms can be used to refer to something else with language. The other thing is talking about under what conditions is an object a person, right? Like, yet Josh acts as if by saying this, I now have this big problem of, oh no, the Trinity is going to be a person. How am I ever going to get out of this conundrum that I've gotten myself into? And I explicitly explained to Josh why this would not be the case. And I want everybody to hear the answer I give, because Josh is going to falsely state that I never answered this question, right? I'm going to answer this question by Josh quick and concisely, and with Josh's help, I'm going to do this. So everybody listen up. This is like a less than 1 minute clip.
So how would you define person?
Having a first person perspective.
Okay, so if I get three people in a room together, is there an additional first person perspective?
Don't give me an example. I'm
no, yes, like no. You gave me the definition of a person that a person is a first person's perspective. If I get three people in the room together, is there an additional first person's perspective at that point? Yes or no?
They are not in a whole relationship.
Okay, yes or no? Okay, so those three being together, they do not constitute a first person perspective. You just said that. Congrats. I'm going to apply that same logic to the Trinity.
Okay, so I took the definition of a person that Josh gave me, and then me and Josh agreed that if we have three persons being together, that doesn't magically create a first-person perspective. That is the same reason that I'm not going to conclude that the Trinity constitutes a fourth person. Like, my reasoning is going to be the same. If you take three people and you put them in a room, does a fourth person suddenly appear? No. What if those three people are part of one band? Okay, those three people constitute one band. Now does a fourth person perspective appear? Wait, what if there's a freak like accident and acid is spilled, and for some weird reason the bodies of these three people, they're morphed and they're firmed together, they're mashed together, and so now it's like a Siamese twin but with three people, and like now they all share the same body. Now they're all one object in some sense. Now is there a fourth person that pops up? No? Congrats. We can all see why, in my understanding of the Trinity, there wouldn't a fourth person wouldn't just like magically be created here, right? This isn't difficult. Josh has answered the quite frankly asinine question that he was trying to levy against me. Okay, so now I'm going to summarize some things here for the sake of time. So shortly after this back and forth with me and Josh about this topic, I think repeatedly try to get him to come back to the exegetical stuff. Like he is clearly like just doubling down on the philosophical discussion. I'm like, we're going in circles, and so I voice my concerns that, hey, listen, we are going away from the stuff that we agreed upon. Let's get back on track. We go around the mulberry bush for a bit, and Josh, he's acting like a dog with a bone, and I can just tell that we're going to keep going in circles about this stuff. And so I put my foot down, and I'm like, we need to go back to the exegetical stuff, right? And I if I remember correctly, I have to do this multiple times, right? I'm not going to show you all the clips of me doing that. If you're a glutton for punishment, you can go watch it happen in the debate. It's not super entertaining, but it's there. So now we're gonna go back to the exegetical stuff. And when I do this, Josh's response is to scoff and accuse me of being scared. He accuses me of not being willing to defend my model. Now a few minutes after that, we begin again to like go down the same path that we've already talked about. Like this just becomes like repeated, right? He just keeps trying to drag me back into this philosophical discussion that I feel like I've addressed. And again, I put my foot down and I ask for us to get back to the exegetical discussion. And Josh makes a comment about how I should try to defend my model as well, which again, I'm happy to do. I offered to dedicate time to Josh for him to attack me, right? I offered him time to do this, which he declined. Now we're in the middle of our dialogue, and Josh is chiding me for not wanting to defend my model when I'm wanting to get back to the thing that he said he wanted to talk about and we agreed to talk about. So then at that point in the dialogue, I even offer to concede the point that I've been arguing just for the sake of argument. Like if that is what it takes to get Josh to move on, right? Because I have repeatedly tried to get this conversation back on track, and Josh just keeps harping on this. So at this point, I'm like, for the sake of argument, if this is what it takes for us to move on to another point in this conversation, I'll concede this for the point of argument. This is only relevant to one of my potential models I put forth. We can go and talk about the other one, right? And I suggest to do this. Now, I want to be clear. All of this argument that we've had up to this point started with me challenging Josh's claim that the Father is what is identified with Yahweh. I challenged him on exegetical grounds and all the philosophical rabbit trails that was supposedly Josh arguing for why we must understand the New Testament as identifying the Father with Yahweh. Supposedly, it's just philosophically incoherent, right? It's just absurd for me to interpret New Testament statements about the Father as anything other than identity statements. But as I explicitly state in my earlier remarks, I could actually agree with Josh on this point and still have a viable alternative model of the Trinity that is partialist or internalist, right? I could agree with the New Testament. I could agree that the New Testament identifies Yahweh with the Father. I could grant that to Josh, right? I could agree with Josh that Jesus is called Yahweh because he is Yahweh's agent, and so on and so forth. I could do all of that and still maintain that Jesus is internal to Yahweh. So I was at this point, I was willing to say, all right, you know what, Josh, I'll concede this for the sake of argument if that's what it takes for us to move on. And then, we squandered so much time on this, like, can we please move on, right? If that's what it takes to move this dialogue further, because I had biblical stuff I really wanted to talk about, right? Now, Josh, he still tries to fight me. Even when I say that, he wants me to concede, not just for the sake of argument, but for realsies. And I'm not going to do that because I think his objections are bad, but we've gone around that, we've gone around that mulberry bush a couple times, and like I'm just not going to keep getting dragged back into that. But then Josh actually, he turns to address my other model, right? So like he turns at this point and says, well, actually, your other model is going to have a similar issue. And it seems like he makes a straightforward fallacy of composition, right? So consider this clip. So at this point, I've gotten Josh to turn his attention to the idea that the Father is Yahweh, but Jesus is part of the Father. That's one of the models I put forth in the beginning. This is what he says.
I just want to just go with what he was saying. So, okay, you grant that there's a problem with the first model. The second model is that there's the Father who is the whole and the Son and the Spirit are the parts. But you have the same problem here. Because wholes, the properties of wholes transfer to their parts, then not just, so the first one was parts transferring to the wholes. Now it's the wholes transferring to the parts. So, for example, you have the Father being unbegotten. Okay, that's then, is that going to be borne by the parts? Or you have the parts, for example, the Son dying on a cross. is that going to be transferred to the whole, which is the Father?
So Josh's argument seems to be, oh, if you say that Jesus is part of the Father, then you have this big problem, which is that now the properties which are true of Jesus, they're going to also be true of the Father, or they're in danger of becoming transferred to the Father, or something like that. And he gives the example of Jesus dying. But to say that a whole bears a property just because a part bears the property, that just is a fallacy of composition. But I know that Josh knows what a fallacy of composition is, right? Like, he's better than that. So why in the world is he saying this? And it seems like Josh's argument requires that by default, all properties borne by the parts are also borne by the whole. And I want to be charitable and try to say that Josh isn't just creating this basic blunder. Like, maybe he's pushing like a methodological, like epistemic issue on like how would I know which properties are shared by which. But then that wouldn't be a philosophical coherent thing. You would say like there's more to be fleshed out in the theory. But then that wouldn't be like this philosophical incoherence that he's pushing at me, right? So maybe you could go that way. That would still be a bad argument, I think. But then at least it wouldn't be a fallacy of composition. But then Josh turns around and he says something like a clip I'm about to show you, which does make me want to just say, no, Josh, this is just a straightforward fallacy of composition. So consider the following clip.
If the Son is the part of the Father and the Son dies, why is it that the whole itself doesn't experience that death?
So you could say that part of the whole experience, but if you use the Father to refer to the Godhead or refer to God in its entirety, which this is something I think the Old Testament and in ancient Eastern context would support, and I think that early church tradition would support, if you understand to refer to the Father as referring to God as a whole, but you understand that the Son is referring to a part of that whole, then it is not the case that the Father died on the cross, because the entirety of the Godhead or the entirety of Yahweh is not the one who was hung on the cross. It was this one who stood in this part-whole relationship.
Yeah, but you understand that it was the part that experienced it. So why is the whole, the Son is a part of the Father who's the whole. The part experiences something. Why does the whole not have that experience as well?
You could say that a part of the whole had that experience. So like I am a whole, right?
Yes.
I have the experience of, we might say my foot fell into a meat grinder or something like that. Sorry to get graphic with everyone. The fact that my foot fell into a meat grinder does not mean that all of me fell into a meat grinder. Like that just doesn't logically follow. And so I could say that the Son, which is part of the Father, died on the cross without saying the Father as a whole died on a cross. And you say, oh, but like a part of it did. Great, that's what I'm saying. A part of it did. And I don't see any incoherence with this. And this is actually the view that the earliest Christian writers like Theophilus, Tertullian, this is the view they expressed.
So in light of Josh's argument, it just does seem like he's straightforwardly committing a fallacy of composition and saying that because X bears a property and because X is a part of Y, now Y must bear that property. That just is what a fallacy of composition is. And what's funny is that in responding to my argument or my position and in dealing with me here, Josh will end up contradicting everything he's argued about up to this point. Listen to what he says here.
I'm punched in the arm, and I can say my arm was punched, but I can also say I was punched.
Wait, what is that, Josh? This is exactly what I've been saying regarding Jesus and why he can be called Yahweh. I gave exactly this type of example earlier in the conversation, and Josh objected to this use of language. Josh has spent the better part of the last hour and 40 minutes telling me that in situations like this, I just can't refer to a part using language of the whole unless I first give this universal philosophical principle which governs all such uses of that language. But now all of a sudden, Josh is perfectly fine to refer to parts with the same language as the whole. Make up your mind, Josh. If it makes sense to refer to you getting punched in the arm as you getting punched, even though the arm is only a part of you, then if Paul thought that Jesus was a part of Yahweh, Paul might also refer to Jesus using language of the whole, just as you admitted we might do with you getting punched in the arm. Same thing could go with the Father. If Paul thought that the Father was a part of the whole, Paul could call the Father Yahweh for similar reasons. In fact, Paul might just say something, I don't know, like they crucified the Lord of glory, something like that. You can't have it both ways. In both instances, we are referring to parts with language of the whole. Now, shortly after this, I address Josh's argument. I say that one of my models would entail that the part of the Father was crucified, but my model would not entail that the Father as a whole would be crucified. So it wouldn't be the case that I have to affirm that the Father died, which is a threat that Josh is like pushing on me. And Josh actually doesn't really object to any of that. He just kind of raises an eyebrow. So that model never really got refuted. Okay. So after this, we go in circles for a few more minutes with Josh claiming I haven't answered the incoherence that he's pushing on my model. I point out that I have, and I've shown you all clips which I explicitly address Josh's questions and, how do I know the Trinity is not another person, so on and so forth. I gave clips in which both Josh and I affirm that parts can be spoken of with language of the whole, and at this point in the discussion, I again have to drag the conversation back to exegetical discussions and put my foot down. Josh again tries to retroactively justify his philosophical critique of my model by saying, oh, well, if your interpretation leads to this philosophical incoherence, then I don't need to do any exegetical work, right? Now, not only have I responded to his claim that my models lead to this type of incoherence, even if Josh was correct and my model of the Trinity was completely wackadoodle, that would not entail that he is justified in his inconsistent exegesis of the scripture. It could be the case that his model beats mine on philosophical grounds, but that wouldn't mean that his exegetical arguments suddenly cease to be like inconsistent, right? Like I could be like, oh yeah, Josh, gosh, you got me on these philosophical grounds, but your exegesis is still unwarranted in its inconsistency. So he really hasn't addressed the issue I was pressing on him. And here's another problem with Josh's retroactive justification of his actions. So if Josh really believes the excuse that he gives, then why did he ever agree to the format that he initially agreed to? Why did Josh agree to save his attacks on my view till the end of the discussion if he's just going to turn around and attack my model the second I present an exegetical objection to his model? Seriously, Josh's justification is that he can attack the philosophical coherence of my model in the middle of this exegetical discussion because he thinks if he can show my model has a philosophical issue, he doesn't need to do anything else exegetically to support his interpretation. If that is the case, then it seems like no matter what exegetical flaw I point out in Josh's model, he would just say, well, your philosophical model is incoherent for XYZ reasons, so I don't have to do any exegetical work. Okay, if that's really the case and you really believe that, why did you agree to not focus on my model until the end when we originally arranged this discussion? Seriously, why did you specifically tell me you wanted to wait to the end of our discussion to take swings at my model if the whole time you were planning on attacking my model anyways? Why did you reject my invitation for us to schedule dedicated time for you to critique my model and say that you wanted to primarily focus on other things if your entire response to my exegetical arguments was just going to be you presenting issues to the philosophical coherence of my model? I don't think this excuse holds up. I don't think any of Josh's excuses hold up. I think they have the appearance of being reasonable if you don't look closely, and I don't think any of Josh's fanboys who watch this video or look at his comments in the comments below it, I don't think they're gonna look closely. And I'll be honest, I've doubted and like low-key gaslit myself on whether or not I'm just out of my mind on Josh deviating from the agreed upon format. Like, and maybe I'm wrong, but when I actually look at how this conversation unfolded and I put the pieces together and I line up, what does he say, what did I actually say, so on and so forth, and I take into account all of the data, it seems like no, Josh deviated from the agreed upon format and he's just retroactively post hoc just trying to justify himself. And so I think Josh's accuse smell, right? They stink. They don't track. And I'll be 100% honest about what I think happened in this discussion. And I'm going to say this as entirely speculative. This is just my hunch, okay? If you think there is a more charitable explanation for, what went out down here, leave it in the comments, right? I'll hear it. My hunch is that Josh specializes in philosophical theology. He knows the philosophical aspects around his model and objections to the philosophical aspects of his model like a back of his hand. Josh rarely talks about biblical theology. I've looked at quite a few of Josh's papers when preparing for this discussion, and even before this, right? I'm familiar with Josh's work. Most of them are Josh focusing on philosophical issues, and I think Josh was outside his comfort zone, and he wanted to steer the direction back to where he was more comfortable. And once he got the conversation there, I think he didn't want to leave his comfort zone and go back out into the area of biblical theology, which he was more unfamiliar with. And here's the thing, there would be absolutely nothing wrong with that strategy if he had not already explicitly agreed to something different. Seriously, debates are chess games, right? And if me and Josh had not already agreed to a certain format, I would not have any grounds to complain about Josh steering the conversation back to his area of specialization. That'd be fine, really. Like, that's a fine strategy in this, this game. This is part of the game. But Josh did commit himself to adhering to a specific format, and he did violate it. And now he's failing. He's just refusing to admit when he did something wrong. And here's the thing. I doubt Josh did this on purpose. I think Josh is probably so used to talking philosophy that he probably just defaulted to doing this. And so I want to extend charitability here, but while I do want to give the benefit of the doubt, it becomes more difficult for me to do that considering the numerous instances in this debate where I point out to Josh that he has deviated from what he agreed to. I mean, I find it difficult when Josh creates narratives afterwards which don't accurately represent what happened. It just makes it more difficult for me to be charitable. Okay, I'm going to stop yapping about that. Let me know in the comments what you think. Am I crazy? So next we go around the mulberry bush a bit more about some topics related to this, and then we finally, guys, it finally happens. We get to go to my next exegetical argument. I'm going to play my presentation of my next exegetical objection in full. It's not very long. It's about 6 minutes, and this is what we spend most of the remaining time about. So I'm going to go ahead and play that here.
So I have two kind of exegetical arguments. I'll break them up, right? So we've already talked about how there is stuff in the Old Testament in which the Son is there, the Son is doing things, but the Son is explicitly referred to as Yahweh. He says, I am, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, go tell him my name is Yahweh, stuff like that. What I'm going to say is that in these instances, the previous objection that I raised, that is going to have the same issue here. And claiming that all these passages, that these are just metonymical, they're metonymical passages about the Father, but when it comes to the Son, like, it's identity about the Father, but all these statements in the Old Testament, these are just metonymical about the Son. I'm going to say that in these Old Testament passages, there's nothing in the text to indicate that the author of the text or the people in the story would have thought that the person being referred to as Yahweh is not actually Yahweh, but just some super special agent of Yahweh. There's nothing in the text itself to justify that. And then the second thing I want to press on this is that this view, that this idea of like, the Yahweh that's referred to is not actually Yahweh, it's Yahweh's super special agent, but like not really him. That view is almost certainly not in line with what the original author intended. To see why, imagine that you were Moses and you're out tending sheep, and suddenly, boom, there's a burning bush. You approach the bush and you see a figure within it. The figure speaks to you in the first person, saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He tells you to go tell the Israelites that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob appeared to you. He says straightforwardly that his name is Yahweh. When you walk away from that encounter, why in the world would you conclude that the figure you just saw was not actually the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What reason would you have to think that despite what that figure said explicitly, he was not actually Yahweh? You wouldn't have any reason to conclude that. You'd be walking away thinking, yeah, Yahweh just appeared to me. And when you tell that story in your community, they also wouldn't have any reason to think otherwise. So when the story gets written down, either by you, Moses, or someone else in the community, it's almost certainly the case that the record will reflect what everyone believed, which is that Yahweh appeared. Not just Yahweh's super special agent who isn't actually him, but Yahweh himself. And so when Josh offers this assertion that in these texts it wasn't really Yahweh that appeared, just a person external to Yahweh, he is putting forward a claim that is almost certainly not what the original author would have had in mind. Now, in contrast, I think there is strong evidence that the original understanding of Moses or the theological community at that time would have been thinking along the lines that my internalist model would have proposed, which is that what they just saw was Yahweh, though a partial manifestation of Yahweh. And to support that, I would go to how ancient people in the ancient Near Eastern world thought about divinity in general. So Benjamin Sommer, in his work, The Bodies of God and the World of Ancient Israel, he examines how various ancient Near Eastern cultures conceptualize deity. And he notes that in the ancient Near East, we encounter what he calls a fluidity model, which is, quote, an understanding of divine selfhood, according to which a deity can produce many small-scale manifestations that enjoy some degree of independence without becoming separate deities, end quote. And one form of divine fluidity that Sommer discusses is what he calls fragmentation. He likens this to the ideas of avatars in Indian religions, in which a deity, through its avatar, brings about partial manifestation that retain divine identity without exhausting it. And another form of divine fluidity that he identifies is the overlap of identity, where gods that are typically conceived of as distinct beings are sometimes understood to be parts of another god. And in his work, Sommer discusses areas where the Old Testament exhibits this fluidity model. And one example is the angel of the Lord, which I know everyone here is familiar with, right? And although he discusses alternative possibilities, Sommer states plainly, quote, the Malach in these cases is not a being separate from Yahweh, whom Yahweh sent on a mission. Rather, it is a part of the deity that can act on its own, end quote. He makes other remarks about that elsewhere. And so what I would say is that the conceptual framework for understanding deity that we know existed in the ancient Near East and in ancient Israel, it fits with the internalist interpretation that I'm proposing. And unlike Josh, who's going to to be introducing concepts into the text that are unlikely to be in the mind of the author, my interpretation is similar to how people in that time and place were already thinking about divinity. And I think it's rather obvious that Moses would not have walked away from the burning bush thinking that he had just saw the entirety of Yahweh. In fact, scripture supports the idea that Moses didn't believe he had seen the fullness of Yahweh. Recall that later in Exodus 33, Moses asked to see Yahweh's glory. He doesn't just ask to see Yahweh because he's already seen Yahweh in some sense. He wants more. He wants, as William Propp notes, to see Yahweh's kingly splendor. And this interpretation is similar to how Rebecca Eichstrom understands Yahweh's statement that Moses cannot see his face and lives. She writes, quote, Moses and the Israelites have seen evidence of Yahweh's presence in the divine glory, and they have survived and not perished. Thus, 33:20 might better be understood as, you cannot see me directly, or fully, or completely, or in all my fullness, end quote. So to wrap this up and put a bow on it, when we start with scripture, when we start with the ancient Near Eastern context and we build our theology from the ground up, what we find is that the visible manifestations of Yahweh in the Old Testament would likely have been conceptualized as partial manifestations of Yahweh. Yahweh in his fullness cannot be seen, but we can see part of Yahweh. And that part of Yahweh, which reveals Yahweh to us, is the Son who is the image of the invisible God, the only God who is at the Father's side. And at no point in making this argument did I just insert a theological invention into the text to preserve my theory. My position is grounded both in the textual data and the cultural and theological framework of the ancient Near East. And for that reason, I think I have the upper hand in interpreting these type of passages.
So what is your question of objection? Because you were saying a lot, so what's the specific question?
Okay, so I'm going to summarize some stuff here. So Josh begins to respond to this argument by bringing in Yahuwah and the apocalypse of Abraham, because Yahuwah is said to bear Yahweh's name. I briefly addressed that. Josh doesn't push me hard on that. I would add here that in the apocalypse of Abraham, Yahuwah, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I think I am. Yahuwah doesn't show up claiming to be Yahweh. He says he bears Yahweh's name, but he doesn't like speak in the first person saying, I am like Yahweh. So that's not really comparable. But again, Josh doesn't push me on that, so it's not worth spending much time on. So after this, Josh commits to a really bizarre line of reasoning. He essentially tries to argue that my interpretation and his are on equal footing because neither one of us affirms that all of Yahweh appeared to Moses. So let's go ahead and see a clip of that.
Yeah, that's fine. So just to understand this, but if I'm correct, the manifestation of Yahweh is still not Yahweh.
It is the manifestation of Yahweh is a small scale or partial manifestation of Yahweh. So there is a it is, you could say it is internal to the being of Yahweh, which is what I hold to, that the Son is internal to the being of Yahweh, not external.
Is it Yahweh who appeared, or is it a manifestation of Yahweh that appeared?
I would say I just said it's a part of Yahweh that appeared.
Okay, so you're in a similar position that it isn't Yahweh simpliciter that appears to the individuals in the Old Testament.
It's a part of Yahweh.
Okay, so
yeah, so it's not. I explicitly said so because I
understand that. Okay. Just see where I'm leading this. So, how is your position then any different from mine? Because it's different if you were to say that it was Yahweh simpliciter that appeared to the prophets, then you would have the upper hand. Because I'm saying no, it's something which is not Yahweh simpliciter. You're saying it's something which is related to Yahweh, is a manifestation of Yahweh, but isn't Yahweh simpliciter.
Because you're saying that it's an agent that is external to Yahweh. You're saying it's an agent that is not Yahweh nor part of Yahweh. And that is not something that I see likelihood of an ancient Near Eastern author saying. Whereas what I'm saying, which is, yes, it is not Yahweh simpliciter, but it is a part of Yahweh, and that is consistent with how we would expect people in this ancient Near Eastern culture to understand the appearance that was just given to them. So that is the difference between you and me. Yeah.
So do the ancient Near Eastern scholars you're referring to, do they use the term part?
Yes, I can give you specific quotes from Benjamin Sommer. And in fact, I did give you a quote from Benjamin Sommer, who specifically refers to the angel of the Lord as a part of the deity.
So let me give a brief example to drive home the difference here. Suppose you come over to my house to have a pool party, and at the door I tell you that our friend Matt is already in the water. Now you walk back to the pool, and you see Matt standing in the pool with water up to his waist. At that moment, are you going to say that I was wrong? No. All of Matt is not currently in the water in that situation, but part of him is. It makes sense to say Matt's in the water. In this situation, that would make sense, right? Now, but now suppose you walk back and Matt is not in the water. He's sitting in a pool chair, all of his clothes still on, and he is bone dry. You go over and he tells you he has not yet got into the pool at all today. In that situation, would you conclude that what I told you was wrong? Yes, and rightfully so. But what Josh is suggesting is that in both of these situations, I am equally wrong. Because in both of these situations, all of Matt, or Matt Simpliciter, is not in the water. Josh is going to say that in both situations, it is still the case that all of Matt is not in the water. So my statement to you is not more reasonable or more accurate under one set of conditions than the other, right? That's his argument. That is obviously bonkers, right? If Matt is up to his waist in water, it makes more sense to say Matt is in the water than if Matt is sitting on land bone dry. Similarly, if part of Yahweh appears to Moses or Abraham, it is more reasonable to say that Yahweh appeared to these men than if no part of Yahweh appeared to them whatsoever. And this became Josh's interpretive strategy here, and I just don't think he was prepared to deal with this argument that I brought forth. My point here was that my partialist model is one which more closely aligns with how the original authors of the Torah would have meant their words. But Josh, in response to me, he grants this actually. He grants that Moses would not have walked away thinking he had seen a mere agent. But then he goes on to try and justify his position by saying, oh, well, the Son is the full revelation of the Father, so Moses' psychological state would have been the same as if he had just seen the Father, which isn't true. If he had just seen the Father, he'd be dead, but setting that aside. But there's a crucial difference here, which is that when Josh says this, he is saying Moses was wrong in his beliefs about the person he just met, and the author of Exodus was wrong, and the author of Genesis was wrong. My view can affirm that Jesus is the full revelation of the Father just as much as Josh's can, but my view can also affirm the meaning of the words in Exodus and Numbers and Genesis as they would have been understood by their audience. And if we have two different models, and one of them can preserve, the original meaning of the text and adheres to, the text and its original audience and its original context, all things, being equal, that one should win out. We shouldn't just go through scripture and just say they're all wrong needlessly just to defend our model. And I never do that when I'm dealing with Josh and responding to his exegetical objections. Okay, so we go around the mulberry bush on this a bit, and Josh tries to argue that my view of Old Testament passages is no better than his. We fight about this a bit, and then Josh asked me to pick a specific passage that we can look at together. I chose Exodus 3, where Yahweh appears to Moses in the burning bush, and speaks in the first person, saying, "I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And he tells Moses to tell others that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob appeared to him, reveals the divine name, so on and so forth. Right. So I'm going to play a brief clip here of how us examining that text went down. All right.
Yeah. So you can just start there. So because this is the story of the burning bush.
Is there a specific? Is it the whole thing, or is it a specific thing that we can?
Yeah, so we can start around verse 3. So Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at the great sign. The bush is not burned up." Verse 4. And then when the Lord saw that he had turned aside, God called to him out of the bush. Okay, so God is in the bush. Moses, Moses, here I am. And then he said, "Come no closer." And then the person says, in the first person, "I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face for the chat is sorry, the chat on my screen is covering that last part. I can't get those last few words, but so there. And then there's a bit of Yahweh commissioning Moses, and then he says, this is the famous verse where he gets the name I am.
Okay, so can you just explain to me how this cannot be interpreted metonymically?
That's not my question. The question isn't whether or not it can be metonymically. The question is, do we have any reasons to think that? Do we have any reasons in the text to think that that was the original indication of the author?
So it can be interpreted metonymically. Is that what you're saying?
You can come up with all types of interpretations. It's not a matter of whether or not can you come up with an interpretation. It's whether or not it's a plausible interpretation.
Okay. So then I'll just reframe my question. Why is it implausible to take this metonymically?
Because I don't think that's what would have been in the mind of the author. And I'm giving you I'm giving you the answer. I'm giving you the answer. You're asking me, why do I think it's implausible to think this is just an agent? Because Moses just encountered a figure who spoke in the first person saying, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." This person says, "My name is, Yahweh. I am that I am," right? So this person is speaking in the first person. This person gives no indication that it's just an agent or just a messenger, which means when Moses is walking away from this, it seems most likely that he's going to understand that he just encountered Yahweh. That seems like to be the most reasonable thing that a person walking away from this encounter would have. I see nothing in here that would give Moses reason to think he had just encountered an agent. Now, you can retro back and you can say, oh, it actually just was an agent and Moses messed up and Moses, got a wrong view here, and we can have that conversation. Like if you want to take the view that, okay, listen, yeah, Moses would have thought about that, but he was probably just had wrong assumptions. Like we can, if you want to go that route, we can have that conversation. But I just want us to get on the same page that if an ancient Israelite had this encounter, they were probably going to walk away thinking, they're not going to have any data to walk away thinking that they just saw an agent who wasn't the actual person that said, I am Yahweh, I'm the God.
Okay, so when you're looking at this then, so your position is that still though, that it's not actually the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that simplicity that appeared. Is that your position?
I do not think it is the entirety of the being that is Yahweh, but I think Yahweh is here actually through a partial manifestation. And this is different than saying Yahweh was not involved at all, but there was just a super special agent who's like Yahweh and he's the one who showed up.
Okay, so 1 second. You're using language that's not helpful. When you say the entirety of the being, what does that mean, sorry?
I mean, I don't think the entirety of the being showed up. I don't know how to phrase that differently.
So, I mean, simply, I was just asking, was it Yahweh that showed up there or not?
I do think it was Yahweh, but in that instance, it was a partial manifestation of Yahweh. So, for instance, if I stuck my hand into, a laundry machine, you could say, like, oh, while I was in the laundry machine, or why my foot was in the meat grinder. Is that the example? You could say, in some sense, that I think the example I gave earlier that was good is like I was in the pool, right? So like, because that's more of language we would use in our everyday life. You would say like, oh, James is in the water. But you would say that whether or not it was just up to my waist, up to my shoulders, or in the entire thing. Like you could use that type of language. But it would be really weird to say that James is in the water when you see me sitting on dry land and there's another guy in the water who just happens to be my agent, and I was nowhere near the water. Like that seems to be the difference between what I'm saying Moses would have walked away thinking and what you're saying Moses would have walked away thinking.
So you think that Moses would have taken the position that there's something over and above the being that he met from this example?
I think he was seeing.
How can you show that from the text?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so notice that I gave an argument for why Moses would not have walked away from this encounter thinking he had only seen an agent. Now, Josh is going to ask, why should we think that Moses would have thought he only saw part of Yahweh in the scenario? Let's see how that goes. Pay close attention to my arguments, okay?
I would say that for a couple of reasons. Two things is because that would be the way. So actually, three reasons. So one is like I think that if any of us had an encounter like that, like we probably wouldn't walk around thinking the burning bush was the entirety of like the concept of the divinity. I think that's kind of obvious, but that's why I cited ancient Near Eastern data to point to this is how they conceptualized appearances of deity. But then I would point to other scripture as well, and I did this way back when we started going down this. I pointed to scriptures where Moses says, "Let me see your glory," which I cited scholars for this, and if you want to dismiss them, that's fine. We can have a conversation about that. I pointed out, it seems to me to make sense that Moses is asking to see the glory of God because Moses understood that there are aspects of God he hasn't seen yet, and that's exactly what I'm saying. Moses understands he has not seen all of Yahweh, but he wants to. He wants to see Yahweh's kingly splendor, and that's when Yahweh says back to him, "You can't see all of me and live."
Okay, so notice what arguments I gave here. I said I think it would be obvious that if something like this happened, most people wouldn't think they saw all of the deity. Like if Jesus showed up to you and he was radiating light and he talked with you, would you think that you had just seen all there was to see? Like of Jesus, you saw the entire being of Jesus? No, ancient people were not stupid. If a bunch of people, if a spirit in a bush like talks to them claiming to be the most high God, they're probably not going to walk away thinking that would appear to them like that's all there is to God. Like God just is a burning bush. Like no. But then I gave two other reasons for supporting my theory. I cited data about how people in the ancient Near East conceptualized divinity, and then I cite other things that Moses says in scripture which indicate that when he says those things, he didn't think he had seen like the fullness of Yahweh here. I cite three things here in support: the fact that it's rather intuitive and obvious, the fact that it coheres with how ancient Near Eastern people thought about divinity, and the fact that Moses says other things which indicate he doesn't think he's seen all of Yahweh. Watch how Josh dismisses these arguments without even trying to respond to them.
Done what I asked. I said from that text. So without going to other texts, without going to your sort of citing of, you were saying some scholarship. Again, I didn't dismiss the scholarship. I just said it's not sufficient to support your position fully. But I would just say from the text itself there, can you show that there is something over and above the being?
So I'm not allowed. So Moses has an experience. So like there's this extended story about Moses and his encounters with Yahweh, and I'm not allowed to like reference something Moses says over here to explain about how he interpreted this thing over here.
I asked you to pick. I didn't pick this verse. You picked a verse that was clearly about Yahweh. Okay, so then I asked you. I'm just asking now. exegeting this specific passage, looking at this specific passage, because you keep on saying to me, would Moses have left this experience believing my position? And you're saying he would have left this experience believing your position. So I'm not talking about another experience. Yeah. I'm talking about.
But the thing he says in that other experience, what I'm saying is, I think that what he says there gives us information about how he understood this verse
doesn't prove your position then.
I think this verse, in conjunction with what we know about the ancient Near East and other things that Moses says, I think this does support my position. And I think that you are trying really hard to get around the fact. I think you know that my view is the most plausible. Moses would have been walking around here.
I'm just saying that you don't seem to put forward a challenge, but then when you're challenged to actually show
I've done it.
So
can I recap this real quick? Wait, can I recap this real quick? I asked Josh, is there anything in this text to support the agent model? And he seemed to say it's undeterminative. There's nothing in my view. There's nothing like for his view. He said it could go either way. But then what I did is I gave, I think, 3 separate reasons for us to think that Moses would have gone this way. And now, but now Josh is saying, well, you're not allowed to cite ancient Near Eastern conceptions of divinity. You're not allowed to cite what Moses says elsewhere. It has to just be.
I'm gonna step in here because we've been at this for about 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And I'll take the bullet here. I'm hungry. I need my protein.
Okay, so he did not even try to address my arguments. He never addressed the first point, which is that this is obvious. And even worse, Josh wants me to argue for why we should interpret a text in a certain way. And in doing that, he doesn't want me to draw on scholarship, which gives us information about cultural context. And he doesn't want me to cite other things said by Moses, which might inform us of how he thought about this event. This is insane. Do you know what we call people who pick up a passage, don't take time to understand the cultural context, and then don't interpret the text in light of its context and the broader narrative? In any other situation, we would call those people fundamentalists. This is the exact opposite of how we should be doing biblical studies. And Josh tries to act like I put the same restraints on him, but I never denied Josh the option to pull in scholarship about cultural context. I never told him he couldn't go to other things Moses said or did. When I challenged Josh to support his argument from the text, I was challenging him to start with exegetical data and not merely import his model and then shoehorn everything so that it would fit. And I would point out that when Josh does, like when he was trying to argue about Philippians 2 with me earlier, he cited scholarship, and I didn't wag my finger at him and say no scholarship is off the table. I didn't do that. Josh asserts that the scholarship I cite is not enough to support my argument. He never explains why. Josh just brushes them aside and then misrepresents me to justify him brushing them aside with the remark that I showed you earlier about how he claims I dismissed Bauckham. You see, I think Josh had no clue how to defend against the argument that I was making here, and he was just in a radical defense mode where he was willing to say whatever it takes to preserve his theory. And that's the problem with a lot of these theologians. They sit around, the philosophical theologians, they sit around constructing models, and then when they have to go to the Bible, they can't just start with the biblical data and let it speak. They have to try and make it fit their own conceptions, regardless of if what they're saying is a plausible interpretation. And to be clear, I have no problem with philosophical theology or constructing philosophical models. If you think I have any problem with that, my dissertation is free on Amazon. Philosophical theology is most of what that book is. So if you think I'm just like bashing philosophy here, go look at that. Go look at chapter 1 or chapter 2 and see how I feel about philosophy. So if you can probably gather from the end of that clip, this was pretty much the end of the discussion. And I want to conclude by noting at this point that at this point in the debate, I didn't even get to talk about what I think is the most damning biblical data for Josh's view, which is that Scripture explicitly says in multiple instances that there is no one like Yahweh. Not only does it say there is no one like Yahweh, there are verses which are specific about how there is none like Yahweh. So, for instance, in Scripture, we get the idea that Yahweh alone created the world. We get the idea that nobody is as mighty as Yahweh. We get the idea that nobody knows what Yahweh knows. Josh's model of the Trinity contradicts every single one of these verses because under Josh's model, Yahweh was not alone when he created, because there was a separate external divine person there with Yahweh during creation. According to Josh, Yahweh is not alone in his might. There is another person beside Yahweh who's caused to exist by Yahweh, external to him, who is just as mighty as Yahweh is. Yahweh is not alone in his knowledge, according to Josh, because according to Josh, there is another external divine person outside of Yahweh who knows everything that Yahweh knows. Any model of the Trinity which does not make the Son and the Spirit internal to to Yahweh in some sense is going to contradict these passages which say things like that. And I only got to mention these in passing in my closing remarks. I didn't get to talk about how Josh's entire model hinges on the idea of eternal generation, which is nowhere supported in Scripture. I didn't get to talk about how several of the earliest Christian writers who predate Nicene Christological controversies directly support my view. I didn't get to talk about how for the earliest Christians, they didn't seem to think that Jesus being begotten necessarily had to do with him being created in existence. They use Jesus being begotten in a sense of having to do with Yahweh emitting or sending forth his logos. And so they had no problem with affirming that the Son was begotten at a specific point in time because they didn't connect that with the beginning of the logos. They just had to, that was the logos coming forth. All of this is data, which is, I think, damning to Josh's model. And I had hoped to talk about it. But because we spent so long derailed, because Josh wanted to pick a philosophical fight with me, and because Josh refused. I mean, guys, I didn't show you in here all the clips of me being like, can we get back to the exegetical stuff? Can we get back to the exegetical stuff? Like, it was multiple times because he just dug in his heels and refused to budge. He was just really stubborn, honestly. We didn't get to get into this stuff that I think is really damning to Josh's model. So let me tell you what I learned, right? In the future, if I do discussions like this, I'm going to require hard, strict time and topic structure. We're going to agree on each topic and the length of time for each topic and all of that ahead of time. I tried to do that with Josh, but he didn't want to, and I should have forced him to. That was my bad. I should have forced him to be like, commit to what topics you want to talk about. Let's get some time constraints for, each topic, or else I'm not going to do this. I shouldn't have agreed to something like this unstructured, where we could just go in circles this much. Honestly, I didn't think this conversation would get this spicy. I'll be honest with you. Listen, Josh is a well-known scholar. He's a well-known theologian, and I thought he was going to do better than this. I thought this was going to go better. I didn't think that we would be at this point in the conversation where he was just like, no, you're not allowed to cite stuff about, ancient Near Eastern culture. No, you're not allowed to cite other things Moses says to understand Moses's, interpretation of a certain experience. Like, I didn't think he would say stuff this ridiculous. I didn't think that he would blatantly disregard the format that we agreed to in the beginning. I guess I went into this thinking that I was dealing with, I went into this thinking I was dealing with a scholar, who would have integrity on how we did the structure. And I want to point out to people that in the beginning of our format, there were times where I said, hey, this is starting to get into this other area. This is going to be one of my other objections, so I can bracket this from now. We can come back to this later, right? I did that. I said, this thing that we're starting to get into, this is related to another, a separate, topic, a separate objection. I'm going to bracket my comments on this. Why didn't Josh do the same? Why didn't, when I was talking to Josh about exegetical stuff, why didn't he just say, hey, James, these questions that you're putting forth about my exegetical interpretation, these are good questions, but for me to give the argument of why I think your interpretation on this is wrong, that's going to get into me doing a philosophical critique of your model, and I know we agreed to save that for the end. So what I'll do here is I'll just say, and I'll make a few remarks about that, and then I'll say maybe we can put a pin on this, and then when I get around to attacking your model, we can revisit this issue. That's all he had to do. All he had to do when I presented my first objection, and I said, listen, I don't think you have exegetical grounds here. He could say, listen, James, I don't think the text itself gives us much, distinction between this, a metonymical or identity sense, but I think there are philosophical reasons that are going to support my theory over yours, but if that's going to be getting into the stuff we agreed to do later. So just like you bracketed your stuff, I'll bracket down. That would have been great. That would have been super respectable. I would have been like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, and then we could have gone on to the next one. But that's not what Josh did. Okay, so I'm going in circles a bit here. Anyways, if you found any of this interesting, a lot of what I've talked about is probably going to end up in the Christology book that I've been working on, assuming I ever actually finish it, which really who knows if that will ever happen. I plan on making that book free, the Christology book free, just like my other two books are free. My other books is What Jesus Didn't Know. This is free on Amazon. I have a chapter in here talking about the Trinity. That's going to be chapter 2, if this was my doctoral dissertation. And then also I have another book that's just on the atonement. This is The Devil's Disbarment. That's available for free on Amazon if anybody's interested in hearing me talk about the atonement. So yeah, if interested in those, you can check those out. Anywho, I won't keep rambling. Everybody have a good day.